Hello and welcome. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. I'm Sarah Coates.
I'm Tom Burgess-Watson.
Coming up on the programme, Donald Trump begins to assemble his top team at the White House, including his so-called ice maiden, Susie Wiles. She'll make history as the country's first female in the senior position.
Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin sends his congratulations to the president-elect, revealing both him and Trump are ready to talk.
And will America's so-called special relationship with the UK remain special? The former British Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, joins us in the studio as he reveals if the current British government is ready to mend fences with Washington. Big show coming up tonight, Tom. We'll be discussing, of course, everything Trump, who he'll be assembling. Very, very interesting.
Absolutely. Some new faces, some familiar faces, some less familiar faces. We'll be talking all about that throughout the course of this evening. But it has, of course, been 3 days since the US voted Donald Trump as their next president. Well, as a new Republican regime returns to the White House, one woman, Susie Wiles, nicknamed the Ice Maiden, is expected to take up the role as Trump's new chief of staff, taking on the most senior advisory role in the Oval Office. And the first woman to do so in history. Well,
during his victory speech, Trump singled her out for her dedication on the campaign. Here's a reminder of what he said.
Let me also express my tremendous appreciation for Susie and Chris, the job you did. Susie, come here. Come here, Susie. Chris, come here, Chris. Susie likes to stay sort of in the back, let me tell you. The Ice Maiden, we call her the Ice Maiden.
And for more, our correspondent Simon Marks is standing by in Washington. Simon, lovely to have you on. Firstly, tell me, what do we know about Susie Wiles? Who is she and what is her backstory?
Well, her backstory, Sarah, is entirely steeped in Florida politics. She ran Donald Trump's Florida campaign in 2016, so that's when she first came to his attention. She also worked with the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, falling out with Ron DeSantis at one point, which is how she came to be part of Donald Trump's campaign in the Sunshine State. She is highly regarded there, viewed as a consummate strategist. To the point that even the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, brother, of course, of George W. Bush, the former American president, part of a family that has no real truck with Donald Trump or the Make America Great Again movement that he leads, congratulated Donald Trump on social media yesterday on selecting Susie Wiles for this particular job. And the reason why this appointment is such a big deal is not just because she's a consummate outsider as far as Washington, D.C. is concerned. She's never held a position in this town, much less anything as high profile as being White House chief of staff, but because by selecting her, Donald Trump is sending a message that he is not going to find common cause in a second term in government, as he did in 2016, with the kind of the careerists, the insiders, the people that really understand how to navigate the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., but don't necessarily agree with his particular populist-infused right-wing ideological philosophy. He is looking to staff this entire government when he arrives here in January only with proven Make America Great Again believers. And in Susie Wiles, he has found a figure who, making history as the first woman to occupy the role of White House Chief of Staff, is, I think, going to symbolize for many people, not only in the Trump inner circle, but here in Washington, that when he gets here, it's an entirely new day in American governance.
And of course, when Trump singled Wiles out in his speech, I think it's fair to say that she didn't look terribly comfortable in the limelight. And I'm imagining that's going to have to change with her new position.
Well, she's definitely not comfortable in the limelight. I mean, there's a point where in the early hours of Wednesday morning, he encourages her to step up to the microphone and make a few remarks. And she absolutely eschews the idea and goes back sort of into the shadows at the back of that stage at the West Palm Beach Convention Center where Donald Trump was celebrating victory. She's not interested in being a public figure. But the truth of the matter is that's another reason why Donald Trump wants her for this job. I mean, he had White House chiefs of staff in his first term in office who turned out to be public figures, including people like General John Kelly, who in the dying days of this election campaign said that he believed that Donald Trump had fascistic tendencies. It is unusual for people in the role of White House chief of staff to play a public-facing role. I mean, it's supposed to be about controlling the president's diary, the president's calendar, and critically controlling access to the president, deciding who gets to walk into the Oval Office at any point to talk to the President of the United States, and critically, who does not. So it is unusual in a way for the White House chief of staff to be this kind of public figure, giving interviews, talking to Americans. And I think Donald Trump, again, by selecting Susie Wiles, is further signaling that everything is going to change at the White House, certainly as far as his second term in office is concerned, versus the first term experience from 2016 to 2020.
And Simon, circling back to her being the first woman, there have been allegations of America being politically sexist, not voting for a female leader in the past. But Susie is the first woman to hold a position like this. Does that show that Donald Trump is more focused on equality than we may have given him credit for?
Well, I think you'll be able to judge that when you take a look at his cabinet and see how many women are sitting around the table. He did have women in his first cabinet, including Linda McMahon, the head of the Small Business Administration in Trump's first term, who is now playing a major role in the transition down at Mar-a-Lago. And we know that there are other women in his life that have been very influential, including during the first term, his daughter Ivanka, and arguably throughout his political career, the woman who's about to become First Lady of the United States all over again, Melania Trump. I mean, it is Melania Trump who told Donald Trump in 2015 that if he made the decision to enter the presidential race, he would win. She was absolutely certain of that. And while there is obviously tremendous national and international speculation about precisely what the state of the Trump marriage may be, she remains an important voice in his ear on matters political. So I think that by selecting Susie Wiles, he's breaking a glass ceiling down there at the White House. But I think he would argue that in Susie Wiles, he believes he has found the right woman for the job because of the way she has co-chaired his campaign nationally throughout the last year and a half.
Always great to have you on, our correspondent, Simon Marks. Thank you.
Well, as we've been discussing, Susie Wiles is said to be one of the most powerful women in America when she becomes part of Trump's top team.
But does she deserve the nickname Ice Maiden, and what is she really like in real life? Well, let's speak to Republican strategist in Florida and the CEO of Policy Standard, Chris Licata. Mr. Licata, thank you very much for joining us. You operate and work in Florida. Firstly, what sort of a reputation does Wiles have on the political scene?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Susie has an incredible reputation in Tallahassee. She runs one of the biggest firms in Tallahassee. They do some of the most revenue. She runs that firm, and she doesn't, if she sends somebody into the Capitol to lobby on a bill, they are very, very difficult to say no to. She gets what she wants 95% of the time.
And a lot is being made about this Ice Maiden nickname. In your opinion, does she deserve it? Well,
she's had that nickname for a long, long time. That's not, I mean, Trump's obviously the president is obviously making, saying it on stage like that makes it a bigger splash, but she's had that name a long time because she's very calculating. She's extremely, extremely calculating. She's extremely intelligent. And, she doesn't mind to throw an elbow when she needs to throw an elbow to get the policy accomplished. She's also not the warm, passionate, cry, all the emotions. She is about data. She's about, she's calculating.
So do you think it's fair to say we're talking about quite different styles between Trump and Wiles? And if you think that's the case, do you think we could be talking about a pretty complementary sort of a relationship here?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, they are very, very complimentary. Donald Trump, we all know how he is, and he's the New Yorker. He's very brash and bull in a china shop. Susie Wiles will complement that fantastically because she gets the job done without being part of the story. And she's going to take what the president tells her to do and go accomplish it, and nothing's going to get in her way. The DC establishment, the swamp is not going to stop her from accomplishing the prerogatives of this administration.
And the fact that she is a woman as chief of staff, in your opinion, how significant is this?
Well, Donald Trump has a very, very long history of empowering women, as much as a lot of the media doesn't report on that. He consistently wants to find the best person for a role, and he doesn't really care if that's a woman, a man, someone of different racial complexion. He wants the best person for the job, and when he finds that person, he doesn't let go of them. He wants that person. He will make them an offer they can't refuse, and there we are. But if that person's a woman, he's happy to empower them. He's happy to. A lot of women who have worked for the Trump organization over the years have mentioned how he'll give them time to go spend with their kids, to balance life, to do all the things, so long as they're actually productive and accomplishing the goals that he is setting forth.
And Chris, just to remind us, I mean, really for the benefit of our viewers, what the role of Chief of Staff is all about and what sort of powers are wielded by the Chief of Staff.
Yeah, so I would argue that the Chief of Staff of the United States, the President's Chief of Staff, is the second most powerful position in the world. It's more powerful than Vice President. It's more powerful than Secretary of Defense or being a general, because you do control the access, you do control the calendar, you do influence a lot of what the president gets to hear. And that's why I think Susie is such a fantastic pick for this, because she's going to be a gatekeeper in a way that is not influencing the president towards a certain policy objective. She's going to put the people the president needs to hear on, crises domestically or internationally. She's going to make sure that the actual experts, the actual data is presented to him in a logical way so he can make a decision and move forward, not try to put the thumb on the scale of what decision ought to be made.
This election has been altogether good news for your state. Do you expect to see more people from your state taking key roles?
Absolutely. From your mouth to God's ears. Absolutely. Florida and Susie should be the first pick. And I think that's a really good sign that we're going to see Senator Marco Rubio become the Secretary of State. I believe in British circles, it's the foreign minister, right? And then we're going to see possibly Congressman Brian Mast, if there's enough room in Congress to kind of take him out of Congress for a 90-day stint and hold a special election for his seat. If we could take Brian Mast, make him Secretary of Veterans Affairs, he's a double amputee. He'd be wonderful at that position. If Senator Rubio is Secretary of State, that does open up that seat to then be appointed by Ron DeSantis, who could possibly appoint himself, or he could appoint his wife. So there's a lot of there's certainly I mean, there's 2,500 positions. There's ambassadorships that have to be appointed. The transition is a monolithic task. And with somebody so entranced in Tallahassee politics at the helm of not just the transition, but the administration, you're going to see a lot of Florida talent promoted into key roles in D.C.
Yeah, and Chris, it's a pretty lengthy process, isn't it, putting together a whole team? I mean, when do you think Trump will have finished this whole process of putting together that new administration?
Well, I think this is a very different scenario than 2016. I think 2016, he was not prepared for the amount of appointments. He was not prepared for who to trust. I think he's used to having a really hands-on approach, and that's just not something you can do when you have this many appointees in this short period of time. And that's, again, the key of putting key people in place like Susie and putting her as chief of staff and saying, all right, hey, Susie, get with the vice president and fill, all of these. I just want to worry about the top 12. I want to worry about the top 20, and limiting himself to worrying about, the direct cabinet and not the director of the FBI or the undersecretary of assistant deputy of health. All of these are political appointments, or who the ambassador to Nigeria is. Like these decisions can be brought to him by Susie, and probably Susie can delegate that down further. And that's, I think, the real excitement about this administration, is that this is an administration that is prepared to delegate, and not to delegate to the party that the established party that we had back in 2016 that wanted to circumvent a lot of the goals of the administration. This time you're going to delegate to people who are completely bought in and on board in accomplishing the goals of the president.
And Chris, just finally, Florida were 30 electoral college votes. Were you ever in doubt?
Absolutely not. No. We took Miami-Dade County. We took Hillsborough County. We took Osceola County. Every single county moved in a more Republican direction. There was never any concern that Florida was in play. Yeah, and it's certainly never going to be in play in the future. I mean, we are a more Republican state than Texas at this point in time. We're the third largest state in the union. Make America Florida is what we need to be doing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Chris Licata, great to have you with us.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has congratulated Donald Trump on his election win, calling him a courageous man. Now, with Trump back in the Oval Office, we're reminded of his signature approach to foreign policy, building personal connections with world leaders, whether they're America's friends or foes. Now, Trump's frequent praise for Putin has often raised eyebrows at home, and on Putin's side, he said he's open for more talks. However, Putin made it clear that his conditions to end the war in Ukraine remain firm. Ukraine must ditch its NATO ambitions and pull out its troops from 4 regions Russia now claims.
So while the negotiation door is open between Russia and the United States, Putin's demands in Ukraine may seem pretty unhinged to some people. Well, joining us to talk about the return of the Trump-Putin dynamic is Thomas Pickering, former US ambassador to Russia. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here, Ambassador. Vladimir Putin has, of course, congratulated Donald Trump on his win, also praising him for showing courage during the assassination attempt, referring to him as a real man, and also saying he's ready to talk. The pair seem pretty close, don't they?
They are, and of course there's something to be gained politically for each of them in working that particular set of issues. Putin gains the kind of respect that he's lost through the invasion, the aggressive invasion of Ukraine, and the starting of a war that most people in the world community doubt was justified. And Trump is seeking to gain the notion that he has inordinate influence and that his promise to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours is now under a test. Although Trump's strategy often is to mention large, exaggerated claims as a way of dominating the airwaves and preventing anybody through the plethora of claims and the volumes and intensity of them to question whether any of them are really true or going to come true. And it's a tactical gambit that he's succeeded in many ways in promoting his own electoral chances, I think to the surprise of many, including yours truly, in the recent election. And we all have to live with the reality. We can hope for things, but we all have to contend with how and in what way we must deal with the cards that are put out on the table, so to speak.
One thing Mr. Trump hasn't said is actually how he would end this war. We did hear, though, from J.D. Vance that getting a deal to end the war would be favourable to the Kremlin. What could we expect to see here?
I think the principal question is open now is where are the territorial boundaries at the end of the conflict through a process of either use of force or negotiation. And I believe what J.D. Vance is more than hinting at is that either the current lines of control, which are inside Ukraine's 1991 independence boundaries, or something that might go back in that direction a little further, might happen. It's been quite clear that President Zelensky understands the political danger of that and the problem that would cause him, Ukrainians, and many European Union members to have a military conflict that most will be sure is contrary to the United Nations Charter restrictions on the use of force, result in a victory for President Putin that he can exploit to his own political advantage.
So, Ambassador, could we be looking at a scenario in which Ukraine is forced to concede large chunks of its territory?
That is certainly what President Zelensky fears, what President Biden made clear he feared, and what I think others believe could lead more to a catastrophic destabilization of the region. And as you know, over the last 3 years of warfare, President Putin has hinted at the use of nuclear weapons. He's kind of pulled back a little bit from that, but has left the question very much open. And the threat to use nuclear weapons is seen certainly as creating leverage for either negotiation or for bringing more people together on his side of the agenda of prosecuting the use of force.
So how concerned should NATO countries be over Trump's comments in the past about his commitment to the alliance, saying that he'd have to look at it again?
But his commitment to the alliance in the first administration of President Trump was to take the goals that the NATO states had pledged to meet of 2% spending on defense and seek to make them an objective which hadn't been met by many NATO states to be something he wanted to have them meet. And he went so far as to say that if they didn't meet them, it would be tantamount to abandoning NATO, and that he would, in fact, adopt that approach in bringing leverage against them to meet those particular goals. So one could count that as using basically the threat to abandon NATO as a way of preserving it from one point of view. The other is it appeared to be a reckless gesture to try to achieve a personal objective of some significance, but which was not going to happen certainly quickly or overnight or necessarily in a way that ratified a new reunification of commitment and reform in NATO to defend countries like Ukraine invaded by their neighbors.
So given what you've just said there, how destabilising is all of this unpredictability with NATO and other allies?
If you concluded from what I said that it was destabilizing, you're exactly on track.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, if possible at all, about the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. It's been a bit fraught in the past, I think it's fair to say. And I'm just wondering how you see events unfolding in that regard.
Well, the famous press conference given in September last year, in which President Trump adopted the view that President Putin was correct in his conclusions about the conflict and how it started, not the U.S. intelligence community, was certainly something designed to try to pull Putin, if you could put it this way, closer into his influence orbit. And Putin's rather generous message within the last 2 days congratulating Trump has certainly borne fruit. Whether this can lead to what I consider to be a very positive conclusion is that conversations between the United States and Russia with the idea of reaching a settlement that at least can consider the ethical principles that have been violated in going to war in an outcome that can help meet those objectives. It won't make everybody perfectly happy, but it will be something that could be equitable and just, is one test. Another test is to use the supply of weapons to Ukraine to protect itself and carry out its self-defense as a lever to seek to enhance Mr. Putin's benefits as a result of any negotiation. And that would certainly have negative consequences of real significance to U.S.-European defense relationships, to NATO, to European solidarity with the United States, and indeed with perhaps driving European defense arrangements further from being coordinated and worked out closely with countries like the United States.
And while we have you, you were also an ambassador to Israel. It's obviously a crucial time. How do you feel Mr. Trump's approach should be or will be when it comes to the situation there?
Well, I think that I should also call attention to the fact that I was first an ambassador to an Arab country, Jordan, and that my view is that one doesn't take sides on the basis of the countries the U.S. has asked its officials to represent itself, but to support the U.S. and U.S. interests. And my view is U.S. interests is totally supported by the return of the hostage, totally supported by the cessation in the huge numbers of civilian deaths that have taken place in Gaza and in Lebanon, totally supported by a ceasefire. And those are the objectives we have been working on and seeking to get carried out.
And just
certainly the necessity, I believe, to consider positively something that many people disparage as being impossible, a two-state solution, would be one of those keys that I think could make something like that happen, but obviously will take a great deal of time and effort, a great deal of persuasion, and a great deal of efforts to satisfy people who see dangers in those solutions, that those dangers can be overcome by peacekeeping, by monitoring, by support, where the relationships that have to be established to achieve that broken unilaterally by one side or another.
And just lastly, one of those relationships, obviously, we haven't talked about Iran yet, and we saw a tough stance towards Iran from the first Trump presidency. Do you think we're going to see more of the same in the second Trump presidency?
Well, I very much supported the idea that we should be talking to Iran with the idea of bringing about what President Obama brought about, and with the help of many people around the world, a agreement with Iran, carefully monitored and very much quietly looked after, but significantly to prevent nuclear proliferation in Iran. And I do not fathom the reason why people oppose that. It may not have been the perfect embodiment of their ambitions, but it was working. Iran had not broken the agreement. I think that's been very carefully examined and ratified by all of our understanding of that situation. And seemingly, there's now an effort somehow that Iran is all at fault in the U.S. withdrawal, which led, I think, to the destruction of something that was extremely positive and could have been improved upon, obviously, if it went ahead, but not by destroying it.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Thank you.
Always an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Moving to the United Kingdom, where there are mixed reactions with Trump's election win. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was among the first to call and congratulate Trump, insisting that the relationship will prosper. But critics worry about trade wars and future support on the Ukraine conflict.
Well, some other concerns are linked directly to sitting ministers, including the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who has used harsh words to describe Trump in the past. Meanwhile, the Labour MP Emily Thornberry in 2019 called Trump a racist and a predator.
Probably the most outspoken critic of Trump, who's also a senior public official in the UK, is the Mayor of London. Well, Trump has previously called Sadiq Khan a stone-cold loser.
Well, from not congratulating his win to expressing his fears for democracy and raising questions about the wars, the Mayor issued a statement. It read, "I know that many Londoners will be anxious about the outcome of the US presidential election. Many will be fearful about what it will mean for democracy and for women's rights, or how the result impacts the situation in the Middle East or the fate of Ukraine." He went on to say, "London is and always will be for everyone. We will always be pro-women, pro-diversity, pro-climate and pro-human rights."
Let's now speak to the UK's former Chancellor of the Exchequer under the Conservatives, who can shed more light on the complex dynamic. Nadhim Zahawi, thank you so very much for joining us in the studio today. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be with you.
Firstly, we're both wondering, what was your reaction when you heard the news that Donald Trump had won another term?
I won 2 bets. I'd been predicting a Trump win for quite a few months now. And the reason being, I think, is what many on the left have neglected, is that the cost of living and inflation, both in the United States and in the UK, actually led to the incumbent losing, and losing badly, whether it was us under Rishi Sunak in the UK a few months ago, or now Kamala Harris, indeed. And I think the idea that we sort of almost dismiss people's concerns about the cost of living, or, oh, well, aren't we doing well because look at us versus a basket of other nations, the G7 or the G20, just didn't resonate. And I think President-elect Trump had great message discipline, partly because of probably Mrs. Wiles, focused very much on the economy and the cost of living. You know, when I think someone I saw tweeting this morning saying that when a portion of Five Guys, which is a famous hamburger place in America, I think probably all over the world, is costing something like $24, you know people are hurting, and you know they're not going to vote for the incumbent. And then focusing on illegal migration, very similar issues to the United Kingdom, and indeed to Europe as well. And I think it's a great lesson for everyone. And I think actually it's a little bit disingenuous and vacuous of the Mayor of London. One, he should be focusing on delivering for Londoners. I think Londoners don't feel very safe, don't feel very well looked after by his administration. Plus, if you look at the results of the presidential election, more Latinos, more black men, and of course more Gen Zs voted for Donald Trump. And I actually tweeted saying that, you know, for the left, do not take that young generation for granted. Do not take the Latino vote or the brown or black vote for granted. And the same is happening in England. Now, under our new leader, Kemi Badenoch, I think Keir Starmer's going to have his work cut out.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned something else on X or Twitter, which struck me as well. You put out a list of things that went wrong, shall we say, for the Democrats. So one of them was, don't make an enemy out of Elon Musk. Now, we spoke to his father together a couple of days ago, and he said his son's role had been pivotal in Trump's election victory. It sounds to me like you might agree with Mr. Musk Sr.
I do agree. And I think, actually, the mistake Kamala Harris made is to allow people around her or herself to attack Elon. People responded to my tweet by saying, oh, well, but he controls this massive media organization in X, or previously Twitter. The Democrats outspent the Trump campaign almost, I think, 2-1. They had every celebrity endorsement, including Taylor Swift, and none of it worked for her. Partly, I think, because actually annoying someone with so much energy and so much talent and focus meant that Elon spent the last few months literally just focusing on delivering Pennsylvania, for example, for the Trump campaign. But the idea that it's because of him buying X for $40 billion, the whole of the mainstream media was up against Trump. They threw the kitchen sink at Trump. And yet people, Americans, still voted for him, including, remarkably, him. None of the pollsters had this, winning the popular vote. It's quite remarkable what is happening in politics. Part of it, I think, is also driven by authenticity. Whatever you may think of him, Donald Trump will be straight-talking. I've just been listening to your interviews previous to mine. World leaders will know that he doesn't mince his words. And I think that's a great strength for Trump. He's a great negotiator, and he won't miss his words, whether with Putin or with Iran.
One thing that we both found fairly interesting today, actually, when you were mentioning social media and you were mentioning the younger vote, was that his 18-year-old son gave him a fair boost in that demographic, with sort of telling him who to go on the podcasts with and that sort of thing. But in terms of the announcements that have been made today, anyone that you think deserves a top job?
I think Mike Pompeo would be a great appointment if he is willing to serve. I think that will make a huge difference, a huge talent. I always thought Mike would run himself. I actually encouraged him to run when we met in London a couple of years back now. But I think Mike would be a great appointment. I wish Mick Mulvaney might come back. I don't think he will. He'd been chief of staff, but of course he's got now Mrs. Wiles in place, which I think is a great appointment. You saw endorsements from across the board of Republicans, Rubio, Cruz, everybody endorsing her appointment, which I think is really an excellent appointment. But, he's got plenty of talent now around him to be able to really make a difference this time round.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the special relationship. I don't know if you like that term, if you use that.
We do like it.
You do like it.
Very much
I'm
so.
talking about the relationship between London and Washington, of course, for the benefit of our viewers. We've got new leadership in both countries, almost in the United States, although another 2 months of the Biden administration. But what is your assessment of what the state of that special relationship is right now?
It is in rude health. I've, for a very short period of time, in between being Chancellor of the Exchequer and then chairman of the party, I ran the Cabinet Office, which included national security. Within that, the relationship of the institutions in the US and in the UK are so deep and in lockstep that it almost doesn't matter who the occupant of 10 Downing Street is or the Oval Office. It really is as close as it can possibly be, which I think is a great thing, by the way, for our two nations, and long may it continue. So I think it was good to see Keir Starmer come out very early on and take a leadership position, because some of his cabinet, David Lammy being one, Angela Rayner and others, have not been as complimentary about President-elect Trump, and it was good to see him lead his party to a very different position this time round and not allow his party, well, apart from Sadiq Khan to attack our closest ally.
What about when it comes to who you believe should be the British ambassador to Washington? It does seem as though the status quo is working out quite well right now. Dame Karen Pierce is due to leave early next year. But what do you think should happen here?
So Karen Pierce is a phenomenal operator in Washington. Best of breed, let me put it that way. She looked after me when I was Chancellor, and I visited the US and met with Janet Yellen and, in fact, Kamala Harris as well. Karen is phenomenal. The speculation, and I hope that Prime Minister Starmer does deliver this, is that her term will be extended beyond the 4-year term, which I think is a really good thing. She has a great relationship with a lot of people around President Trump. She worked with the Trump administration previously. So I think my advice would be keep Karen in place.
OK, and if someone does replace her, I mean, lots of speculation as to who replacements might be. I see you smiling. I'm wondering if you're one of the people who might consider such a position. And what about Nigel Farage, who would be perhaps, well, he's made no secret of it in the past, that being one of his preferred outcomes?
I doubt whether a Labour Prime Minister would bring back a previous Conservative Chancellor to be ambassador to Washington. I think, and I said this a few days ago, to the British media, I think, as I did when I had to deploy the vaccine for the UK, I vaccinated the United Kingdom, I was the vaccine deployment minister, and one of my sort of pivotal decisions was to put party politics aside and work with Sadiq Khan in London, with Andy Burnham, another Labour mayor in Manchester, with Andy Street, a Conservative mayor in Birmingham, with the Scottish Nationalist Party in Scotland, because they were the governing party, and Labour in Wales. If I were Keir Starmer, I would bring Nigel Farage into Downing Street, set him a task to say, come and help your country, you're now a member of Parliament, and deliver a comprehensive trade agreement with the United States of America. Because of his close relationship, deep relationship with Donald Trump, I think it would be something that would be very difficult for Nigel to turn away from. And I think if Keir Starmer was a big Prime Minister, I would certainly offer that opportunity to Nigel Farage.
And what about, OK, someone like Boris Johnson's probably seen this incredible comeback in the form of the second Trump presidency. Do you think he's calculating in his own mind, thinking, well, if Donald Trump can do it, perhaps I can do it too?
Well, if you follow social media and saw his message to our new leader, Kemi Badenoch, which was clear and unambiguous support for Kemi Badenoch, and that Kemi will lead the party and lead the party to a general election victory. My prediction is that unless Labour deals with illegal migration and the very high numbers of legal migration to the United Kingdom and the pain of the economy, and this budget has not helped, the recent budget from the British Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has not helped, they may be a one-term government, and I suspect that we will see Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister next time round.
And you still identify with the Conservative Party? You
I
say
do.
We,
yes.
Our party, that's
yes.
with whom you still identify?
Very much so.
We don't have much time left, but I've got in front of me here your book, The Boy from Baghdad, From Waziriya to Westminster.
Beautifully pronounced.
Thank you very much. It came out a couple of weeks ago.
It did.
And, of course, Waziriya is a reference to where you were born and where you grew up. It's a suburb of Baghdad, I believe. How do you feel about Donald Trump's pledges, being from the region, to fix the situation in the Middle East? Do you think he's capable of doing that?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think in many ways what the region has lacked is clarity from Washington. Let me be honest with you. I was deeply disappointed at the time when President Obama said that there would be a red line not to be crossed in Syria, and then he allowed it to be crossed with the use of chemical weapons. I was deeply disappointed with the JCPOA. I was one of the MPs in Parliament who spoke out about trying to get Iran to not just talk about the nuclear portfolio, but also about the proxies and the malign influence of those proxies across the region, which has taken us to this place, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. None of that happened under the presidency of Barack Obama. I think President Trump will be very different and will be very clear in what he will want to see happen in the region. And we have to take him at his word. He says he will end these wars. And I wish him luck in delivering that. We need to see, I think, the Palestinian people have a better future. They deserve a better future. They deserve better government. And I hope President Trump will lean into that, as well as making sure that the hostages are returned.
Nadim Zahawi, we have really loved having you on. Thank you so much for your time and very excited to read this book. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Great to see you.
Many former members of Team Trump 2016 could find themselves back in the White House following the inauguration in January next year. Well, especially those who've criticised the treatment Trump has endured during his legal cases. Well, former Republican Congressman George Santos has continued to show support for his former president, who he worked with in the last administration. And earlier this year, publicly made a pitch to work for Trump's administration as a director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
But could former Republican Congressman George Santos be one of them? Well, let's speak to him now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Santos. You, of course, have some legal woes of your own, but let's focus on Donald Trump, who's got plenty of legal issues hanging over him. How do you think he's managed to pull off this second non-consecutive term at the White House?
Well, Tom and Laura, thank you so much for having me. I think, look, the American people are the reason President Trump is now President-elect Trump once again. I think it was clear evidence that the American people didn't buy the lawfare wagered against the former president, now president-elect. And overkill from the Democrats and the Biden-Harris administration displayed that they had disdain for the rule of law and that they had no problem weaponizing government. That is why President Trump was able to overcome not only his legal weaponized charges, but also to convince Americans all across the country and flip every single swing state in his favor, from the Rust Belt all the way to the Arizona and Nevada desert. I think it's very telling that the American people saw right through the weaponized government and the lack of delivery for the American people that the Biden administration had.
OK, now one of the big stories of today, of course, has been the trickle of announcements regarding top jobs in the Trump administration. Just curious to know, have you been in touch with anyone in the Team Trump?
I have not. I have barely slept over the last 72 hours as I've been doing a lot of these coverages. I was covering the story internationally, the election internationally on election night in the UK. And I've been doing a set of these interviews because I think it's important to communicate to the entire world. The United States is back. We are back with peace. We are back with resolve to solve the chaos and fire that the world is on. So I have not had yet time to speak to anybody in Team Trump, but I look forward to speaking to them in due time.
Earlier on in the year, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you'd like to head up ICE, which is, of course, the immigration body. And clearly immigration was such a huge issue on the campaign trail. Now, were you to get that job, how would you approach it? And in particular, there's this challenge that Donald Trump has set out regarding mass deportations. I just want to know how you see that working.
Look, I look at it this way. The United States today has approximately 3 million people with removal proceedings letters. These are people who had their immigration courts heard, their immigration cases, heard and adjudicated by an immigration judge. And they've gone through the appeal process and it's been turned down. And they are set for removals proceedings. Based on our honor system, they have yet to self-deport. So I think it's only fair to say that it wouldn't be too much of a burdensome job to find those who have actually had their day in court and do not meet the standards or qualifications to remain in this country permanently or lawfully, and to remove them. And that on its own should be a lot of time. And on the latter part of your question, with all the other immigrants and immigrant issues we've had under the last 4 years, this disastrous border crisis, it's a sensible touch and go position. However, we will probably be working as a team, as Republicans in government with control of every branch of government, to find resolutions and solutions to give these people peace of mind that we will try to find remedies to perhaps create paths to residency for them. However, nothing is guaranteed, because at the end of the day, everything will pin back to who you are as an individual. So these cases will be looked individually. ICE's job is not so hard. You have 3 million people, get them gone. They do not belong in the United States. And I think that's a fair statement for any sovereign nation that's trying to protect its sovereignty. If you give these people the right to an adjudication and they fail to adjudicate it in the court of law and they have a negative outcome, they should be removed.
Mr. Santos, how will you deal with officials that refuse to cooperate, like the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey? She says she won't comply.
Well, it's not a matter of complying. ICE has the authority and autonomy to operate in all 50 states. It's a federal agency. She cannot shut them down. Clearly, she won't help us with local law enforcement sharing data or actually doing ICE holds in, minor domestic disputes where they end up in custody overnight for, nonsense. However, we don't need the cooperation. We have the information. The federal government has the ability to track and settle down those people. And there's targeted communities with clusters all around the country that are hotspots and hotbeds for the cluster of these people with removals proceedings levied against them. So it doesn't matter when you have the governor of Massachusetts or California saying they won't comply. ICE still has the constitutional authority to operate in those states.
Is the return of Donald Trump good or bad news for America?
I think that Donald Trump is the best news for America and the best news for the world. The Middle East is on fire. Donald Trump got elected, and the day after, you see Hamas already starting to call for we should go into a ceasefire. I mean, this couldn't be clearer that peace through strength is important, and that people like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis are going to be scared of a President Trump presidency, as well as the Ayatollah. Tehran's on the run. They don't know what to do. They're absolutely frightened that Trump's returned to the White House. And that's the best outcome for global peace.
I just want to ask you, Mr. Santos, about something on the campaign trail that seemed to be a big deal at the time. Obviously, it feels like a distant memory now. I'm talking about Garbagegate. And I just want to ask you why you think Garbagegate ultimately really didn't seem to have a huge amount of impact on Trump. Obviously, he won, and he also won quite conclusively amongst various demographics, including certain demographics of Latino voter.
Well, look, as a Latino voter myself, I can say it was a bad taste comedy done by a comic who had no business being at a campaign rally. That said, those were not the words or sentiment of President Trump displayed throughout the course of his first presidency or the entirety of this campaign that lasted a whopping 2 years. But the reality is that Democrats were grasping for air at any possibility of trying to derail the campaign. But here's the problem. Following that, President Biden turned around and called President Trump and his supporters, which is largely half of America, garbage. The sitting president of the United States, in the sense of Garbagegate, called half of the American population garbage. So a lot of these things backfired because the reality is they weren't hiding their true sentiments, and they were trying to tie other people's speeches to President Trump, and it failed.
Trump's also been talking about facing an enemy from within. Who or what is he referring to here?
Well, I believe it's the radical administration of Biden-Harris who weaponized government, not against only him, but all of their political enemies and rivals, which that does make them the enemy within. But I don't think that means that's the American people. I think that's an administration of rogue individuals willing to do what it takes to win political office. And that does become a threat to democracy. Unlike them calling President Trump a threat to democracy, they displayed threatening behavior and actions to our democracy here in America. But today, America wakes up every single day up until January 20th, a day closer back to restoring common sense freedom, and peace through strength around the world.
Donald Trump says he's planning to dismantle what he's calling the deep state. And I've seen some things on your X feed that suggest perhaps you actually agree with that. And if that is the case, perhaps you could tell us what dismantling the deep state actually would entail.
The expectation is that by the end of fiscal year 2025, 50% of the bureaucratic state of America is dismantled by seeing redundancies being cut, excess waste of taxpayer dollars into frivolous salaries being cut, and reducing our deficit so that we can stop imploding our debt, which is ballooned to $35 trillion at this point. So it's a matter of cleaning house, having an efficiently run government, tight with close margins and little waste. So that's why I'm very enthusiastically excited to see the DOGE Department of Government Efficiency, head up by Elon Musk, be enacted, because that's exactly what they will do. And that's the expectation that I and many Americans have, is to reduce the size of the federal government.
Okay, so when we hear rumors about this so-called enemies list, I'm just curious to know what your take is on that, and who you think should perhaps be most worried about its existence.
Well, look, I don't think there's a real enemy list. There's no Gestapo type approach to this. The reality is President Trump's just going to move on and govern for the American people. Democrats want to levy that ideology that, oh, he has a Gestapo list and he's going to try to settle scores. I actually highly doubt that will happen. And I highly doubt that he'll allow his attorney general to weaponize the office of the attorney general in the Department of Justice against Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any of his former political rivals. I think this is about moving forward. And I think that's exactly what President Trump is going to do.
He's been talking a lot about uniting the country. How is he planning on doing this?
Well, I think he showed that throughout the campaign. Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., podcast superstar Joe Rogan. These are all people who ideologically have sparred with President Trump in the past. I mean, and in some cases have even voted to impeach him. The reality is that he's been able to join these people together on a common sense wagon. And I think what we saw was an enormous growth of various coalitions across the country in growing to support President Trump based on unity. This was the great unity tour. This was the great unity ticket. And we totally show that when the American people complied and subscribed to the unity ideology that the Trump campaign was presenting to them. And therefore, I think President Trump will continue on that beat moving forward as he continues to embody and embrace everyone and every single person of every political and ideology within the spectrum.
And what's the likelihood that we'll see a more, let's say, serious Donald Trump this time around?
Well, look, if Donald Trump becomes too serious, he ceases to be Donald Trump. Donald Trump is by de facto an entertainer, right? But he's also a great businessman, a titan who rebuilt the skyline of Manhattan in New York City. So the way I'll put it to you is, I think we already have a serious Donald Trump. We're just going to have a more intelligent Donald Trump who knows how the government works this time around, more so than he did in 2016, not allowing himself to be swamped by swamp characters and creatures within his administration. So a first good sign of that is the appointment of Susie Wild, the first ever female chief of staff to the President of the United States.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Republican Congressman George Santos, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
As well as his loyal group of supporters, many members of the last Trump administration may have found themselves outside his circle of trust and even on the so-called enemy list, including the former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who had this to say about his former boss when asked about him back on Al Arabiya in September.
Well, Trump says openly that he thinks his personal relations with the head of state, particularly of American adversaries, are an exact description of the state-to-state relationships between the United States and that other country, North Korea or whatever. That's completely wrong. There's certainly a role for personal relations and international affairs, but these hard men, Putin, Xi, Kim, they know what their national interests are, and that's what they pursue. They're not pursuing personal relations. I've been in rooms with Trump and all three of them at different times, and know them otherwise. Look, I think they believe Trump is a laughing fool, and they will take advantage of him accordingly, and that's dangerous for the United States, obviously.
Okay, well, we can speak now to Ambassador John Bolton, who we just heard there in that clip, who is, of course, the former US National Security Advisor. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been 2 months, roughly, since we spoke to you last. Do you stand by the comments you made when you spoke to us last time?
Sure, Trump hasn't changed in that period, and now that he's won election, I think we're going to see an intensification of efforts by foreign leaders to influence him and to try and move him in their direction on the issues that are important to them. It's not clear Trump has any better understanding than he ever did before of what these issues really involve, what the stakes are, what the risks are. But it's never deterred him from engaging in the past, because he just doesn't think things like factual information or those sorts of variables really mean anything. He does think it's all about personal relations.
And Mr. Bolton, how did you react when the news came in that Donald Trump had won a second term at the White House?
Well, I was asleep, actually. I could see the direction things were moving in, and I figured I might as well get some sleep. It would be a long couple of weeks ahead. The polls were very close. It could have gone either way. There's no doubt about it. And Trump's got a mandate, but it's not a huge mandate. And, we'll see what he does with it.
Okay, so we've heard that clip of you speaking to us just before we crossed to you. You've also described Donald Trump at other stages as being unfit for office. So I'm assuming that you've ruled out, have you, any future collaboration with the next Trump administration?
Right. Well, as the saying goes, I'm not sitting home alone by the phone waiting for him to call. That's for sure.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask you as well, someone who was quick to pick up the telephone was President Vladimir Putin, who congratulated Donald Trump on Thursday and praised him for showing courage. She says that Moscow is ready for dialogue. I'd just like to get your take on how you'd characterize the state of relations between those two men.
Well, it has been reported that Trump has had a number of phone calls with Putin during the time after he left the presidency and the election. It's not clear to me that that's accurate. The Russians deny it, but maybe it's true. I think that Trump felt he had a very good personal friendship with Putin. I don't think that's how Putin saw it. As I said a couple of months ago, he thinks Trump's an easy mark. It's somebody he can take advantage of. He knows how to manipulate him. He uses flattery and other techniques to get what he wants from Russia's national interest perspective. And I think that obviously between Russia and the United States at the moment, the question of Ukraine would be number one on the priority list. And I'm sure Putin is considering exactly how in that conversation to move Trump perhaps to call for a ceasefire and negotiations or whatever Putin thinks would put Russia in the best bargaining position.
So if there is a possible end in sight for Ukraine, is there any indication at all that Mr. Trump can make good on his promise to fix things with a phone call?
Well, I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I mean, Trump has said a variety of things, including that he would get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and solve it in 24 hours. Zelensky has already made the obvious point that isn't going to happen since Ukraine isn't going to surrender. But here's where this personal relationship issue comes into play. I don't think Trump thinks very highly of Zelensky. I think Trump still believes this fantasy that Ukraine was working against him in the 2016 election. He still wants to know where the famous Hillary Clinton computer server is, where it's hidden in Ukraine, and he resents the idea that Ukraine was used against him in his first impeachment. Whereas the view that Trump has in his mind of Russia, and Putin in particular, is much more favorable. And I think any kind of interaction that Trump might initiate is very likely, in fact, almost certain to end in something detrimental for Ukraine.
And with regards to relationships, can Trump use his relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also leaders in the Middle East to bring about peace in Gaza and also in Lebanon?
I think what Trump wants more than anything else, both in Ukraine but in the war in the Middle East as well, is he wants it over and out of the way by January the 20th. He thinks these are Biden's wars. If he had been president, as he said during the campaign, neither war would have happened, which is these are statements that are obviously neither provable nor disprovable, but only to tout his own virtues. But what he really wants is not to have to deal with them. And from that perspective, he doesn't necessarily have a preferred outcome for the Middle East or Ukraine as long as they go away. I think the chances of either conflict going away are essentially zero. So Trump will have to deal with them, but it's not because he has a plan for how they would end optimally from the American point of view. He just would rather not be bothered. He has other things on his mind, like initiating a trade war with most of the rest of the world by imposing tariffs on all goods imported into the United States. Of 10 or 20%. It's a proposal that could crash the American economy and crash the global economy as well.
And obviously, to resolve the situation in Lebanon and in Gaza, obviously Iran has been playing a part in all of this. And I'm just wondering, how worried do you think the Iranian regime should be about the return of Donald Trump?
Well, I think they are worried. I think their efforts to interfere in the election were try and slow down Trump. Of course, the Russians were doing the opposite. They were trying to help Trump because they wanted him elected. So maybe the two canceled out. But I think it's widely held in the United States as well as in Israel that Iran is responsible for this conflict in the Middle East. This is not a war of Palestinians against Israel or a war of Arabs against Israel. This is a war of Iran against Israel, and manifested through the terrorist groups that Iran has armed and equipped and trained and financed for many decades, not for the use of the terrorists, but for when Iran felt it was an appropriate moment to strike. So I think this is an opportunity for Netanyahu, particularly during the transition period between the American election and the swearing in of the new president on January the 20th, where Netanyahu may have a relatively free hand to go after other targets in Iran, including the nuclear weapons program. Now, whether he will or not, I don't know, but I don't think Trump would voice objection to it.
Well, the return of Trump probably wasn't the desired outcome for a number of European and NATO countries. What do you, and also the leaders, do you think their apparent sense of vulnerability is justified? Can Europe actually go it alone?
Well, I don't think in present circumstances they're capable of it for a long time. And unfortunately, their unwillingness to spend what they should on defense plays into Trump's hand. He's trying to tell Americans that this alliance means we defend Europe, we get nothing out of it. And they don't pay us. So why are we doing this? It neglects to explain what a collective defense alliance does that helps make the U.S. more secure, as well as the Europeans. And so I'm very worried that this could end up with miscommunication between the European countries and the United States, where they now have President Macron of France and others saying we need an independent European military capability. Honestly, if they go too far down that road, even more Americans than Trump will say, well, fine, let the Europeans defend themselves.
You mentioned the transition to the new presidency just a moment ago, and I just want to ask you about your thoughts with regards to the transition. Do you think it's going to be peaceful? And given what we've heard from the outgoing Biden administration, do you think it's going to be productive?
Look, I think almost every transition in American history has been peaceful and particularly more recent years, very productive. It was Donald Trump's exit in 2020 that was atypical of the transition process. And I personally have been involved in quite a number of them, both going in and going out. So it's something it's part of it's not in the Constitution, but it's part of the norms of the way Americans transfer power peacefully after an election. As I say, the only real exception to that norm was Donald Trump. This time, conveniently for Trump, he won. So he didn't invite Biden to the White House in 2020, but Biden has invited him for lunch, and lo and behold, Trump's going to go. So I give Biden credit here. It's got to be painful for him. He was driven out of the election by his own party, couldn't defend himself in the general election against Trump's attacks. But as the outgoing president, he's doing the right thing. He's extending the open hand to Trump. He's offered to cooperate with Trump's transition team. That's the right way to go. And it is an example. Maybe Trump will pick up on it.
During his campaign, Mr. Trump talked about facing an enemy from within. In your opinion, who or what was he referring to there?
I think Trump was referring to anybody who disagreed with him, and that's a long list of people. I do think a retribution presidency is on his mind. I hope I'm wrong on that, but knowing Trump, I don't think so, and I think it could cause the country a lot of damage. We'll see what happens. Maybe he can be distracted by his appointees to do other things. I hope that's right, but I don't think so.
Yeah, we're just receiving word, actually, of the authorities in the United States trying to pursue legal recourse with regards to the Iranian assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And given that news has just come into us, I just wanted to ask you, given what we saw on the campaign trail, so much of it was unprecedented, not least one real assassination attempt and some other attempts that were interpreted as being real, although there were no shots fired. Do you see a risk of more of the same, some violence between now and January when he's inaugurated?
Well, I think the two attempts against Trump this time are not Iran-related. They were due probably to emotionally disturbed people, and you can't rule that out. But I don't think there's going to be any significant violence related to the election. Now, in part, that's because Trump won. And, he's not alleging the election was stolen. It raises also the question, why didn't the Democrats steal it this time if they stole it in 2020? It helps undercut the whole theory that there was an effort by the Democrats to steal it in 2020. Trump lost it in that election, and he just can't admit it. That's the real problem. But hopefully the transition goes forward and we have a peaceful transfer of power. I think the Iranian threat against Trump is real. I haven't read this latest indictment, but in my own case, about a year and a half ago, they indicted an Iranian official named Shamanpour Safi, who was trying to hire a hitman to assassinate me. So this is just one of several efforts by Iran to go after current and former U.S. officials and private American citizens like Masih Alinejad, who was the subject of exactly the same kind of effort. This is totally unacceptable. And I do think, if nothing else, because Trump himself understands the nature of the threat, that his administration may be more active in trying to prevent Iran from doing it, not just threatening them.
Yeah, a little bit more clarity on that report just coming into us. U.S. prosecutors announce charges in alleged Iranian plot to assassinate Trump. That's the latest we've got for you on that. Clearly, in this environment, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people in the United States. A lot of people will be fearful of a second Trump presidency. Do you think in this context, security for the president-elect is going to have to be beefed up?
Well, I think after the assassination attempts, the Secret Service did increase protection. They're a very professional force. These earlier attempts were obviously very problematic, but I think they're going to be as careful as they can be. And in the run-up to the inauguration itself, I'm sure security in Washington will be at its most intense.
And just lastly, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the lineup in the Trump administration. Lots of announcements with regards to people in the team. I just want to ask you about a comment that Donald Trump made about you. I mean, an extraordinary comment, actually. He made it to Joe Rogan, describing you as a whack job. I mean, what went through your mind when you heard the former president and the president-elect, which Donald Trump is, making a comment of that nature?
Well, it's the way Trump is. It's a kind of juvenile response. But, after all, he hired me after watching me on Fox News for many years. So maybe he should ask himself why he did it.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Coming up next is Riz Khan.
Absolutely. We'll be back on Monday at the same time. Until then, from all of us here at Al Arabiya News, thanks for watching. Stay tuned.
Good night.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan in Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation that is still coming to terms with the outcome of the U.S. elections. In this episode, we'll consider the implications for this divided country, for the Democratic Party, and for conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. First up, Al Arabiya's chief correspondent, Simon Marks, has seen it all during decades of covering the political beat in Washington. But he's never seen anything quite like this. So Simon, 8 elections you've now covered. How did this one compare with the previous ones?
Well, Riz, I think that it is always said every 4 years that the United States is about to engage in the most important election of everybody's lifetime, and Americans are always told, the future of the country depends on the outcome of this election. This time round, it had the added benefit of being true, right? There is no question that this was the most important election any of us is ever going to cover. Because of the stakes, and the stakes are absolutely clear. We know that the Trump 2.0 administration is going to be much more radical. I mean, this is what they describe their plans to be, than its predecessor, that he's learnt from what he thinks were the mistakes of the past, which was the coming to terms with people that didn't necessarily agree with him but brought expertise to the administration. So I think that it was always apparent that this was going to be an absolutely vital campaign, and a campaign that was elemental in terms of discussing the future of American democracy. And then the twists and turns, the departure of Joe Biden from the race, the drama of that, the injection of Kamala Harris being given 107 days to try and persuade Americans to get behind her. First of all, she had to introduce herself to them. Then she had to explain her policies to them. She was better at the first part than the second part. And it all culminated with the repudiation of Democrats, both in the battle for that building, but also in the battle for Congress, for the United States Senate.
So that's what I was wondering, with those twists and turns you just described, how difficult did it make your job? Because, of course, you're always expected to be on top of things, but, you wake up and things have changed that morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no campaign where everything goes according to plan for the two candidates, and indeed the whole concept of the October surprise, which is never that much of a surprise in recent years, exists to underscore the fact that this is always going to be a deeply, deeply unpredictable campaign. But a campaign in which you see the President of the United States succumb to a cabal by members of his own political party, orchestrated by one of his best friends, Nancy Pelosi, with whom Joe Biden has not spoken since he was defenestrated. The notion that we were going to watch his rival, Donald Trump, first of all defeat him in a television debate, then survive an attempted assassination that produced some of the most iconic images any American election has ever generated. You know, him getting back on his feet, the hand in the air, fight, fight, fight. The two conventions, always great images, you know, iconic images that come out of that. The Republicans leaving their convention in Milwaukee, absolutely convinced that they had this election in the bag because they were still at the time taking on Biden, then getting knocked on the back foot by Biden being replaced by Kamala Harris, then the attempted assassination, the attempted assassination, of course, happened before the Republican convention. All of these things brought together and underscored, I think, a really brittle sense in this country that the tension, the anxiety, just the sheer length of the campaign, the amount of money that was spent on it, the fundraising itself. I mean, all of us, journalists, my wife, who's not a journalist any longer, receiving endless fundraising messages on email, on telephones. Every 10 minutes her phone was buzzing with another request for funds. It's all added to this notion of tension and unease here.
And it's all about the aftermath. One of the big worries was the country was so divided that whatever the outcome, there would be potentially violence on the streets, there would be a lot of division. What sense do you have, it's only been a few days, but what sense do you have of the aftermath?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a building down there that is a commercial building that just a couple of days ago was ringed with fencing because the owners of the building were worried that, like the White House and the Vice President's residence, it could get ransacked and looted in the event of violence. That has all suddenly dissipated because really of the size of the victory. I mean, I think that this town particularly is despondent. It's a Democratic Party stronghold. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people here who realize they're not going to be able to stay here, partly because Donald Trump wants to replace them with ideologues, and partly because, you know, in every time there's a transition, the Republicans are coming to town, the Democrats in large measure are leaving. But I think the shock to the system of the size of the victory, the one outcome of this election that no one thought was likely was a Trump landslide. Democrats said they thought a Kamala Harris landslide might happen. Most people thought narrow win for Kamala Harris, narrow win for Donald Trump, days, weeks of tension, possible unrest, possible protest. Nobody thought it's going to be a Donald Trump landslide and it will be resolved within hours of polls closing. And that's where we are, and the Democrats have said they're going to engage in a peaceful transition. And I think that mostly in this town there will be despondency, especially when we get to January and we're going to see some very uncomfortable imagery relating to Democrats leaving the White House, the Republicans arriving. I mean, it'll be not entirely dissimilar, I suspect, to when Donald Trump came visiting the White House after his first election win, and there's this iconic picture of Obama staffers gathered on the lawn watching Trump arrive, and they all look like absolute death warmed up. And I think we're going to see similar imagery this time around.
Have you had a chance to talk to any of Donald Trump's detractors? People
Yes.
like John Bolton, who, you know, was terrified of, to some degree, terrified of a Trump
Yes.
victory because he said, you know, now this time, as you alluded to in the first part of this, that he really has a better idea of what he can do. And how have those detractors, I mean, some of them have to run for the hills according to the threats.
Well, some of them have already left town. I mean, I know of two detractors, both of whom are not in Washington, D.C. One had already decided to leave the city some years ago and just get out of Dodge altogether, and the other one of whom deliberately positioned themselves overseas during election week because they were worried about what might happen. And in the aftermath of election week is suggesting that they are going to decouple themselves from the United States and establish themselves overseas instead. I think there is going to be an awful lot of that. And I think it will be because some people physically fear their own safety. And I think it is also because lots of other people will realize that their ability to build their careers here and, you know, pay their bills and look after their families is going to be heavily constrained as a result of the outcome of this election. So they're, in many cases, looking overseas. I was talking to a friend in London earlier today who was telling me that he works for a firm that has a department that deals with expats that is apparently overrun in the last 48 hours with requests from Americans for more information about how they can move and rebase themselves in the UK. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement.
What about those who suddenly seem to side with Donald Trump, RFK Jr.,
Absolutely.
Elon Musk? I mean, those were kind of surprise twists.
Opportunity knocks, doesn't it? I mean, Jeff Bezos, who stopped the Washington Post here from publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris and sent Donald Trump congratulations messages over Elon Musk's social media platform yesterday. I mean, opportunity knocks, absolutely. Elon Musk definitely going to play some role in government. I think not in a cabinet position, because to do that he'd have to divest himself from his business interests, which seems extremely unlikely. But he's clearly going to be a Trump whisperer. RFK Jr., I mean, there is talk about becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, some in Trump world have denied that's the plan, but RFK Jr. keeps fueling the notion. You're going to see ideologues and some of these external figures, these characters that have attached themselves to Donald Trump like a barnacle, playing a role in the administration. I think it's absolutely vital to underscore that Trump 2.0 is not going to look anything like Trump 1.0. First Trump Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, lovely man, foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice because she said, you need a man who understands the world. Rex Tillerson, this guy from Exxon, he'll sort you out. There's going to be none of that. General Jim Mattis, James Comey at the FBI, they're not going to work with any of these people. And that's going to change the character of this city.
Having seen how tight the polls were literally up to the end, the landslide victory was, of course, that much more of a surprise. To what degree do you think it might say something about America not being ready for a woman president, as they keep saying, possibly even not one of colour?
There's no question that that was a factor. I think there are multiple factors in the Democrats' demise in this election, but misogyny and racism was clearly a substantial issue. Barack Obama himself identified particularly the racist aspect of it when he went on the campaign trail and said that black men particularly he was hearing and believing were saying that they were not ready for a black woman in power. I think the misogyny issue is strong. I'm not sure it's as strong as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost her race, but it's definitely still a factor. But the Democrats' drubbing was so comprehensive that it's about more than that. In 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. 4 years later, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. That's 15 million people who have decided they don't want to vote Democratic this time round. Some of them may have racist reasons for doing that. Some of them may have misogynistic reasons for doing that. Bernie Sanders says a lot of them are members of the working class who feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, so they're going to abandon the Democratic Party. We know that many of them are Latino voters who are American citizens from Latino families who are hostile to the new wave of illegal immigrants coming into the country because they argue they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, did everything the way you were supposed to do it legally, and they support the deportation of some of these illegal immigrants. So I think that the question for the Democratic Party now is elemental. I mean, clearly so many things went so wrong, even including how long it took to put the arm on Biden to get him to abandon his re-election quest, that there's no one thing you can fix or blame. You can't say it's just misogyny or it's just racism. It is a whole packet of problems that the Democratic Party didn't see coming.
Simon, there was a lot of talk about uniting the country after the election. I certainly know, I come here frequently and I sense the tensions and the divisions. Do you see any, as someone who's covered so much of this going on, do you see any signs there might be a move towards unity?
I mean, they always talk of a move towards unity after every election. And by the time the cadences of the sentence have finished echoing around the room that you're in, those calls have gone nowhere and are going to go nowhere. This is a tribal, 50-50 polarized nation. And there is nothing that the outcome of this election or Donald Trump's arrival in the White House said yesterday is going to heal the nation, said that before, then he came and made the inaugural speech about carnage in America. There's no fixing it. These are two tribal groups of followers of the Democratic Party and the new Trump-dominated Republican Party, with disaffected Republicans in the middle, not quite sure where they're going to end up. And finding common cause between any of these people is going to be difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult because it's geographical, right? I mean, there are places where Republicans feel comfortable and at home, and there are places where Liberal Democrats feel comfortable and at home, and the twain don't often mingle and meet. And I think there's a fundamental problem to the concept of a homogeneous society in one nation here, because it increasingly doesn't exist.
Well, of course, all the factions came out during the campaign. You saw the Arab Americans, Black Americans, and so on. The Arab American story was an interesting one. How many people actually decided to support Trump from the Arab American community? Some people believe it's because of the backlash due to the lack of action taken by the Biden administration with the Israel-Gaza conflict, and some just, I guess, feel that Donald Trump is going to be someone who represents them better. He's promised to, stop all wars in a day, basically. But they're going to have to face the consequences of what he does or doesn't do now.
Yes, and remember that he's talked about possibly reimposing his Muslim travel ban, which is going to have an enormous community impact on the Arab American community. But, I mean, the Arab American community in this election played a fascinating role, because they essentially said to the Democratic Party, enough. For 3 election cycles now, Barack Obama has gone to all Democrats and said, you may be disappointed in what we've done. Perhaps we haven't delivered on the things that you wanted, but you've got to vote for us because we're better than this guy, right? The Arab American community and other Democrats, furious over Gaza, in this election said, no, we're not going there. We're not doing it again. Bill Clinton traveled to Michigan days before the election and said to the Arab American community, Kamala Harris has said she's going to do what she can do to end the war, and she's going to try and advance the prospects of peace through diplomacy. That ought to be enough. That was the phrase he used to Arab American voters. Get over it. It ought to be enough. And it wasn't enough. And they had Jill Stein in Michigan, third-party candidate, appealing for their support. You can deny Kamala Harris the White House by voting for me if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. And it proved to be effective. And I think that message to Democrats is a broader message than one that's just coming from the Arab American community. You can't keep saying, vote for us because you may not like us very much, and we may have disappointed you, but we're still better than the alternative. They have to go back into the kitchen and cook up a better proposition than that for 2028.
Having followed all the promises, and of course they are just campaign promises, what are you expecting to occur in this coming year, for example, or say post-January in 2025, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine and to Israel-Gaza?
Well, let's do Russia-Ukraine first. He's going to force Volodymyr Zelensky to make peace with Vladimir Putin and to give up parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, I think everybody understands that. The Europeans understand that. President Zelensky understands that. Vladimir Putin certainly understands that. He wants it done and dusted. And this is not just Trump, but the key figures that surround him in the foreign policy field say, we need to get this sorted out because we don't want to be obsessively involved in European security. We want to focus our attention on China. Europe's got to look after its own affairs. And the first plank of that is we sort out Ukraine. And the only way you sort out Ukraine is by pulling American military support and forcing Zelensky to make peace. So I think that's relatively clear. On Gaza, Trump and Netanyahu have been talking all the time. They've been speaking in recent days. Before the election, they were talking, with reports that Donald Trump said to Benjamin Netanyahu, get the military action in Gaza wrapped up by the time I take over in the Oval Office, because then it's got to be all about the day after resolving Gaza in whatever way you can, getting the hostages out, become a big problem for any occupant of that White House if there are still American citizens being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But for the Trump administration, it's all about the Abraham Accords. It's all about expanding them, trying to bring about the normalization in ties between Israel and Saudi that many here in Washington believe the Hamas attacks of October the 7th was designed to derail. And so they want to get that Saudi track moving. And the way they think they do that is by ending the violence in Gaza, moving to the day after, which is obviously the really complicated bit, while simultaneously using the communication channels that they opened up through the Abraham Accords to try and get back to a place where you can think about the normalization of ties between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. That's what he's going to go for. It will obviously be incredibly complicated and difficult to get there.
Simon, to wrap up, with 8 elections now under your belts, do you ever see a third party emerging in the US? It seems like the idea of a third voice just completely disappeared this time.
I thought you were going to ask me if I've got a ninth one in me.
Yeah, well, there is that as well.
To which the answer is I'm not sure. A third party is so difficult here because the Republicans and the Democrats, we talk about them being the two big political parties. They're not just political parties. They are money machines. And one of the most amazing things about this election has been the fundraising. This has been a $10.5 billion election. Kamala Harris raised a war chest of $1 billion and was still asking for money from Americans even as the election got underway. So for a third party truly to catch fire, it's got to have big money behind it and national organizational heft. And that's why the genius, in a way, of Donald Trump was not to launch a third party. It was to take over the Republican Party and completely retool it from the inside. And that ultimately may be what some Democrats out there want to do with the Democratic Party. But to do that, you've got to say goodbye to Nancy Pelosi. She's a major cash provider through her fundraising capacities to the Democratic National Committee. The Obamas, obviously amazing fundraisers. You're going to have to take the reins of the party and then retool it, much as Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party, because launching a third party here is just so incredibly difficult. The climb is too steep.
It's frightening, isn't it? It's all about the money now.
It's absolutely all about the money, 100%.
Simon Marks, let's hope you get a 9th election in you, because I'd love to come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Riz.
Cheers. Dearborn is the first Arab-majority city in the entire United States, and for its 55,000 citizens with Arab roots, a death toll of 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza looms large on the ballot. Nearby, the mayor of the city of Dearborn Heights, Bill Bazzi, made his choice. He endorsed Donald Trump. Mayor Bazzi, welcome to the show. Now, the city of Dearborn Heights is a special place in terms of its community. Tell me a little bit about it.
Right now, we're probably about, it's a good city. It's a diverse city. We have, it's pretty diverse with, Arab Americans, and we have a lot of Europeans, Italians, Polish, Macedonians. We have Hispanic, African Americans in the city. So it's pretty diverse. It's a good city. It's prospering, and there's a lot of great things happening here. So I'm proud, honored to be the mayor of this city.
Why has it become such a significant place in this U.S. election?
Well, for the last 4 years, that I served in the military. I served 21 years in the U.S. Marines. And I'm always about trying to do the right thing, for first, our country. I sworn in several times to defend the Constitution of the United States, foreign and domestic. And when this election is very critical election for not just for the United States, but for the world. And for the last 4 years or so under the current administration, we've seen nothing good. Everything we're seeing is not good for this country or for the world.
How have the people in the area responded to having the spotlight shone on them so directly?
Like everything, I always say, if you can't please everybody, and if you try to please everybody, you don't please anybody. And a lot of, I'm getting a lot of great feedback. A lot of people came up to me. They said they're proud that I made that decision. We're putting the city in good spotlight, just to show that, hey, we will speak. We will voice our opinion. We will voice our thoughts. And that's some of the feedbacks that I'm getting. And I'm getting a lot of great feedbacks that not just for the decision that I decided to endorse President Trump, but also that have a community leader that actually speaks out and just say that what a lot of my constituents are feeling.
Now, during an election campaign that's been so divisive at a national level, how hard has it been to maintain unity among the population?
Well, it's pretty hard right now. This is one of the most critical time in our history, not just, for this country, the world, but also for our city, because a lot of you have few people are divided. They want to go Green Party. A few people want to go with the current administration. But I think once this election is over, we all need to work together. Try to bring the community back together.
So then, what would you expect from a second term of a Donald Trump presidency?
Well, President Trump actually, so when he was the president, our economy was much better. It was prospering. The cost of living was much lower. And, the most important part, the peace. And we need stability. When you don't have stability anywhere, especially in the United States, the whole world is looking at us. They're looking at our leadership. And they want a good commander-in-chief. And I think Mr. Trump will be the great leader, great commander-in-chief. Then it will hold everybody accountable.
Well, presumably that's why you've endorsed Donald Trump so wholeheartedly for this election. How have the people of your city reacted to your decision?
So I've been reaching out to a lot of people. A lot of people have been reaching out to me. Obviously you're not going to get backings from every person in the city. But the majority of the people that I talked to, people that reached out, and this community is not bashful. They'll reach out to you if they don't like something, and usually the people that like something, they don't respond, because they know things are going well. They don't respond, or they don't make their comments heard. But the people who are negative, the first to voice their opinion. But I can tell you, a lot of people have been reaching out. A lot of positive feedback I'm getting. And I've been talking to even youth that just become of age to vote, 18 years old. They're very motivated, very supercharged, because they do have families overseas and they're voting for Trump.
Now, other Muslim mayors from your region of the USA, including the mayor of Hamtramck, Amr Ghalib, have also endorsed Donald Trump. To what extent do you think this is a direct backlash because of the Biden-Harris policies towards the Israel-Gaza conflict?
Well, I can't speak for other mayors, but for me, that's one of the biggest contributor is I'm all about peace. I'm a person that grew up in the war. I was born in Lebanon. I was raised in Lebanon to about 12. We immigrated to the U.S. because of the war, because of the bombardment. I've seen the ugliness of the destruction, the death in the street. It was very, very traumatic, for a 12-year-old. And it's, that's one of my biggest decisions. My biggest decision was that, to vote for Trump, because that killing and everything going on in the Middle East right now is giving a lot of people flashbacks to when they were like myself, when we lived in the Middle East. And a lot of kids, the 18-year-olds, they still have families over there. They coordinate with them. They visited their homeland, and they feel the same way. So that's very critical, to all of us while we make that decision. I can't, like I said, I can't speak for other mayors or other leaders, but for me, that's my deciding factor, and that's why I went with Mr. Trump.
What do you expect as a lasting legacy of these U.S. elections for the people of Dearborn Heights?
I think it's going to be tough the first few weeks, because, people have their sentiments, they care about one party over the other, the Green Party. But I think once the election's over, I'm very confident Mr. Trump will actually come out and will try to bring people back together. And people will see that he wants peace, and he's trying to get this my city back together, so people can see it. Once they see results, then people are going to say, you know what, I didn't vote for him, but I should have voted, and I'm glad he's the president.
Now, considering the tensions in the country and the divisions, there are real fears that following the election, irrespective of the result, that things might spill over onto the streets. What fears do you have that might happen in Dearborn Heights?
Well, we have the people here. I mean, they're very civilized. You know, if there's any chaos, it's going to probably come from somewhere from the outside the city. But we are prepared as a city to handle anything. And, you know, we are monitoring the situation. You know, we will be monitoring the polls to make sure that everybody has the freedom, their right to vote. And whatever happens, you know, afterwards, you know, we're taking precautions just to make sure that there's no any issue in our city. And we will be our police from both local, you know, state, you know, will be monitoring the situation. And my chief is also working with outside agencies to make sure that no issues will happen in my city or neighboring cities.
Mayor Bill Bazzi, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
So we've heard the thoughts of an Arab-American mayor in the US. Next, we'll hear the thoughts of an Israeli hostage negotiator and campaigner for peace in Gaza, Gershon Baskin. Gershon Baskin, thank you. It's good to have you on the show. Donald Trump keeps promising he'll stop all conflicts, including those Israel has with Hamas and with Hezbollah. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, how did he fare in his previous presidency, except perhaps infuriating the Arab world in December 2017 by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the American embassy there?
He certainly did that, which infuriated the Arab world. He moved forward with the Abraham Accords, which, while it created a situation of peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, they did throw the Palestinians under the bus. But it should also be noted that Trump's deal of the century that he put on the table was essentially a two-state solution. It allowed Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, which was, of course, unacceptable to the Palestinians. But Trump did put out there the principle of the two-state solution, and because Netanyahu could not go against Trump, the Netanyahu regime at that time actually accepted it. So one could say, in retrospect, that there was an agreement for the first time with Netanyahu to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. Of course, that didn't go anywhere. The Arab world rejected it, and it was a bad plan to begin with. But the principle of two states was there. Now, Trump is totally unpredictable. So it's impossible to imagine what he might do, what he could do. And when he says this war has to end, it could be a blanket green light to Israel to continue bombing Lebanon and bombing Gaza and bombing the West Bank. Who knows what Trump would allow to be done?
Well, considering what you've said, and despite the major decision on Jerusalem, Arab Americans now seem to be backing Donald Trump for his presidential candidacy in far greater numbers than many might expect. Are you surprised, and why do you think that is?
Well, I'm surprised if American Arabs vote for Trump. I know that the big issue for a lot of American Arabs is that they may not vote at all, and that is a sense of vote for Trump. I can't understand how any American Arab could vote for Trump. He's a racist. He's against minority groups. He wants to throw unregistered immigrants in the United States out of the country. And I think that American Arabs, American Muslims will suffer from the racism of another Trump regime. We saw it in the past in one of his first policy decisions when he was president was the Islamic ban. The ban on Muslim entry into the United States. So I think that every American Arab should be very careful thinking about voting for Donald Trump. I think it endangers them. I think it endangers the Middle East. It endangers the world.
Well, it's interesting because going to that two-state solution thing, Donald Trump, contradicting his previous position, has more recently stated publicly that he doesn't want or he doesn't see a two-state solution working. And that's getting him cheers, of course, from American Jewish and Christian leaders who support the idea of a greater Israel that effectively takes over the existing Palestinian territory. So how will that equation ever be balanced?
I can't be, because Donald Trump is unpredictable. He can say one thing one day and completely the opposite the next day, and no one questions him on it. We have no idea how he will act if he does re-enter the Oval Office. We see him cozy up to dictators around the world and go against the allies of the United States in Europe and around the world, against the Ukrainians in favor of the Russians. The man is unpredictable and dangerous.
How is he managing to woo the Arab American community? I mean, Donald Trump also recently wrote a letter to the Lebanese American community saying he would, quote, fix the problem caused by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and stop the suffering and destruction in Lebanon. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how has that been able to convince Lebanese Americans that he's the one to vote for in this election?
I have no idea. You really have to ask them. I don't understand it at all. I think that he would give Israel the license to continue bombing Lebanon wherever Israel wants to continue the flyovers over Lebanon. Even if they go back to an agreement based on UN Security Resolution 1701, Israel is demanding the right to continue to enter Lebanon whenever they want, whenever they see fit, and to continue their flyovers, violating Lebanese sovereignty. And I think that Donald Trump would probably give Israel a green light to do all of that. So I would say to Lebanese Americans, beware. Know who you're voting for. Know what this man is capable of doing.
Decades of working in trying to get this peace process move forward. You're, of course, very familiar with the Israel-Lebanon axis. And quite often, Iran is brought into that equation as backing Hezbollah and so on. And it's almost like now, painting that specter of Iran in all of this. So what are the consequences of Israel's continued military campaign there on the potential for a wider conflict that might draw in the US? And is that even a factor being considered by American voters?
I don't think it's being considered by American voters, but it is still very dangerous. And the situation here is very tense with Iran. Iran attacked Israel with ballistic missiles at the beginning of last month. Fortunately, those missiles were shot out of the air by our neighbors, by the United States, by Israel itself, and there were no casualties from 181 ballistic missiles that were shot at Israel. The Israeli response was a measured response in that they didn't seek to hit civilian targets or the energy infrastructure or the nuclear targets. And as such, it could be a hold and wait period unless there's going to be another Iranian response. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei has said that there will be another response, but we don't know if that's empty words or there will be a response. This whole situation between Israel and Iran could be calmed down for the moment. But the most important thing is to get the war in Gaza over and to get the war in Lebanon over. That's what's inciting the rest of the region for a much more dangerous escalation.
Right, and perhaps the Arab American voters see that there is that prospect if Donald Trump wins, because he keeps saying he will stop all conflict. Now, what do you think would happen, Gershon, if Donald Trump wins and nothing changes? Would there actually be any consequences?
I can't predict. What I know is that the United States has to weigh heavily on Benjamin Netanyahu, on Prime Minister Netanyahu, to end the war in Gaza. This war must be ended. Look at all the damage that's been done in Gaza. 2 million people homeless now, over 40,000 people killed, thousands probably buried under rubble still, 101 Israeli hostages in Gaza. This all needs to end. Hamas needs to exit Gaza. There needs to be a civilian, technocratic, professional government taking over the Gaza Strip, perhaps the entire Palestinian Authority. We all need new leaders here. Netanyahu cannot continue as the leader of Israel, having the responsibility for what brought us to October 7th and what happened on October 7th and since then. And the Palestinians need new leaders. Mahmoud Abbas is in the 18th year of a 4-year term. He's 89 years old. The divided Palestinian leadership needs to be united. Palestinians need to have enough security and stability to be able to go to new elections. And this regardless of who is the next president of the United States. We need to make sure that this war is the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We need the help of the United States, regardless if it's going to be Harris or Trump, to enable us to do that. We need pressure from the United States on Israel to end its belief that the solution is military, because there are no military solutions here. And we need the United States to use its influence over Israel, because only the United States has enough influence over Israel to make Israel make a policy shift like that, with recognizing that there can be no military solution here. We need to get back to diplomacy and a political solution.
There's been a broad consensus the Israeli Prime Minister has no issue with ignoring the requests of the US leader nowadays. And would that change with whoever's in power?
Well, I think it has to, and I think we have to recognize that Israel is more dependent on the United States today than ever before. I'm not a professional in the field, but I made a list of about 15 issues on which the the United States has leverage over Israel. Now, some of these things are said behind closed doors. Some of them, when they're said out in the open, make Israeli politics shake. We call back to Henry Kissinger, who just used the word reassessment of American policy toward Israel. It shook up Israel. Or James Baker, when he was Secretary of State, who said, this is the phone number of the White House, call me when you want to talk to us. That shook up Israeli politics. It led to the election of Yitzhak Rabin and the throwing out of Yitzhak Shamir. So there are things that the Americans have. The doomsday weapon, which I don't think that they would use, is stopping to arm Israel entirely. But there are many things that the United States provides Israel with, including a political cover in international forums like the United Nations Security Council, which doesn't always have to be there. Now, we have a window of opportunity still from November 6th until January 20th, when President Biden can actually be, as a free agent, use the power of the presidency to apply pressure on Israel, on Netanyahu, to end this war. This is on the condition that Hamas puts a deal on the table that's acceptable, which is ending the war and bringing the Israeli soldiers out of Gaza, releasing an agreed number of Palestinian prisoners, releasing all the hostages from Gaza, and Hamas agreeing not to be the government in Gaza on the day after the war. Now, I know Hamas has told me that they're willing to do all of this. They need to make it official. They need to tell the mediators in Qatar and in Egypt that they're willing to put this deal on the table. And on November 6th, Joe Biden, regardless of who wins the election, is a free agent. And we've seen at least 2 American presidents in the past change their policy on Israel after Election Day. Barack Obama and even Ronald Reagan, who began a dialogue with the PLO after Election Day.
Thank you very much. Look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.
The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine is another conflict that could hinge on the outcome of the US elections. During the presidential debate on TV, Donald Trump refused to say whether or not he wanted Ukraine to win, and instead he repeated his claim that he could settle the war in 24 hours. His rival Kamala Harris has spoken about continuing US support for Kyiv. To consider the consequences of the election on the war, my next guest is the former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, whose dossier famously linked the 2016 Trump campaign with Russian electoral interference. He reveals more about that episode in his new book, Unredacted: Russia, Trump, and the Fight for Democracy. Christopher Steele, glad you could join the show. Let me start by asking you what you'd expect to be the likely consequence for the war in Ukraine.
It'll all be different, that actually some sort of deal will be imposed on Ukraine, which will be very detrimental to the sovereignty and democracy of the country and its security. And indeed, that will have reverberations around the world in terms of defending and standing up to bullies and to international autocrats in places like Taiwan and the Balkans.
So when Donald Trump says he can settle the Ukraine war in a day, even if that was possible, how do you think he could achieve that?
Well, it's hyperbole, of course, from Trump, as everything is. But Trump's concept of how this war ends is in a deal between him effectively and Putin. And Putin is in a position now where he has done extremely badly in the war and has not achieved any of his initial aims, which is a big surprise to all of us. In fact, although Russia has definitely an advantage on the Donbass battlefield at the moment, which is one particular region, it's hardly really moved forward much since the initial period of the invasion in 2022. And the one way in which Putin can get off the hook here, having lost between, it's argued, 500 and 600,000 killed and wounded, which is astonishing numbers, sort of 30 times the size of what they lost in Afghanistan, is for Trump to be re-elected and for an isolationist foreign policy to come into force in Washington. And that, of course, doesn't just depend on Trump. It also depends on what happens in the elections to the Senate and the House of Representatives, which are also significant, I think, regarding Ukraine's future. Because any deal, in fact, even with Kamala Harris as the president, any deal to roll over US financial and military aid to Ukraine would depend on congressional approval.
And of course, in the background, we have NATO. How worried do you think NATO leaders might be about the outcome of this US election?
I think in general they're very apprehensive, but I suspect that the further east you go to countries like the Baltic states, and Poland and Romania, there is particular anxiety about this because Russia won't stop at Ukraine. Putin may have to go back home and rearm and re-equip and everything his armed forces. But a bit like the 1930s, he'll be back if he prevails in Ukraine, and he'll back in terms of aggression towards the Baltic states, I would think, in the first instance, and possibly others. And the risk is that Trump will either leave NATO, or he will make the Article 5 mutual defence guarantees much weaker and not reliable, and will encourage Putin on. So I think that is a great concern.
Well, early in the US presidential campaign, President Putin made a comment that he preferred Kamala Harris to win and liked her laugh. It was widely considered to be a joke, but in your opinion, which candidate would Vladimir Putin like to be in the White House next?
Almost certainly Donald Trump. And in fact, if you look at some of the things that have come out in this election campaign, the so-called Tenet media case, which you'll be aware of, where the Russians were caught pouring $10 million into an internet chat show or whatever in America, thoroughly behind Trump. And indeed the attempt a couple of weeks ago to smear the vice presidential candidate Tim Walz on the Democratic side with all sorts of smears and slurs about his private life, were clearly emanating from Moscow, and a sign that, in fact, the Russians are more than ever keen that Trump should win and that Republicans should win, and that America should adopt an isolationist and pragmatic, as it were, I would say mercantilist foreign policy.
Do you still believe Russia holds some kind of leverage over Donald Trump? And if so, what's the nature of that leverage?
I suspect that they do hold leverage over Trump. That leverage could vary from financial information to personal conduct information. I suspect that hasn't been fully investigated by the US security authorities, particularly when Trump was president. And it's something that there's clear evidence that this has been talked about, not just by our sources back in 2016, but by other people. If you look at the Mueller report, for example, there is a conversation there recorded between Michael Cohen, who was working for Trump at the time, and a Georgian Russian contact of his in Moscow, about there being compromat sex tapes involving Trump. So I don't think this is unique to us. I think it's something that's out there and is still a big question mark.
From what you know of Vladimir Putin, which of the candidates do you believe could be the most effective in dealing with him?
Again, I think it's not just the presidency that matters in this regard. It also depends on who's running Congress, who are leading the key committees. Because, as I said, I think the key issue at the moment will be whether American aid to Ukraine, financial aid and military aid, is rolled over. And we saw how damaging it was earlier this year when there was a hiatus in the aid being provided to Ukraine because of stalling in the American Congress, and the fact that over half the Republican members of the House voted against this aid package. But I believe firmly that the way to deal with Putin is through close alliances with NATO, with the EU, with the European countries and other allies like Japan and Korea, South Korea, that is, Australia.
Now, you became famous as the author of what's called the Steele dossier, that explored Russian interference in US politics and the connections that Donald Trump had or didn't have in Russia that might have wanted to influence the US election outcome in 2016. From what I understand, that was essentially raw intelligence that was meant to be a guideline for a further investigation. So what were the consequences of that information going public?
Multiple consequences, I suppose. The most serious, I think, was the impact it had on the sources that were used in the reporting. And as I say in my book that came out recently in the United States, Unredacted, two of those sources we've never seen or heard of since. And I think in general, we know that all of the sources that were exposed or potentially exposed as a result of BuzzFeed's decision to publish the dossier almost unredacted, was that they all come under tremendous pressure. And as a wider consequence of that, I think, a deterrence for any other sources in Russia to come forward, not only to us, but also to Western governments and Western security and intelligence services to report on these issues, because it was clear that there was a risk that certainly the Republicans in the US Congress, the media and Trump might well expose them to retribution.
What's the chance that the facts will ever be fully uncovered?
It's a good question. I would say that we won't know the full truth of any of this. And it's broader than just Trump. It's also the truth behind the Litvinenko case, the Skripal case here in the UK, other cases of a similar sort. Won't happen until and unless the regime in Russia falls, that the Putin regime is expunged or is defeated, and that the files of the Russian security services become available to us. That is unlikely, but it's not entirely impossible. If you remember back in 1990 when East Germany collapsed and the Stasi files were made available, those that weren't destroyed, very interesting files that gave us a lot of detail, not just actually about what the East Germans were up to, but also what the Russians were up to, the Soviets were up to with them in East Germany at that time. And of course, ironically, one of the Soviet intelligence officers who was serving in Germany or in East Germany at that point was one other than Vladimir Putin.
Now, as you say, you've written a book, Unredacted, Russia, Trump and the Fight for Democracy, and in it you refer to what you describe as the dodgy dossier episode. How did it affect you personally?
I think it's had both a good and a bad effect on me. It's not something I would have sought, would be the publicity and the fame or the infame surrounding it. But I think two things. One, it's profoundly affected the security of myself and my family and my colleagues and so on. We have to be a lot more careful in what we say and do. We are subject to very significant cyber attack, for example, most of the time, and in our movements. But I think on the other hand, it has enabled us to have a platform to be able to talk to the media, talk to the public. It's rare for people of my background to have that position or that ability, and to transmit a message, which is really one of warning, that these countries like Russia and China, these autocracies, are determined to weaken the West and undermine our way of life. And sadly, the measures that we've taken against them so far have not been very effective.
What do you believe to be Vladimir Putin's end goal? Do you think he sees himself as a modern-day czar, as some commentators speculate?
I think he's an opportunist and more of a tactician, actually, than a strategist, and that's not untypical of an intelligence officer. And the other thing he tends to do is over-personalise international relations in looking at different leaders he meets and has interactions with. But I think his overall goal is obviously to consolidate his own corrupt wealth and that of his cronies, and the fact that they can transmit that wealth down to their children and their relatives and their mistresses and their wives and so on. But I think on a larger scale, and particularly in recent years, he's wanted to be someone whose legacy would be that he started to rebuild Russia's security space as was occupied by the Soviet Union by building out from the collapse, as he sees it, of Gorbachev's Russia, Gorbachev's Soviet Union, and playing a particularly crucial and central part in this, it's important to understand, is Ukraine, which he doesn't regard as having been a separate country at all or a separate people. And that's the fundamental problem when you come to discussing, for example, whether there can be any peace deal with Russia over Ukraine. Putin, it's important to understand, does not believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent entity, and probably thinks that at least 3/4 of it should be brought under Russian rule and Russian control, which is real anathema, of course, for those in Ukraine who have tasted some degree of freedom and the rule of law and other things in recent times.
Ultimately, how do you think Russia will come out of this current conflict with Ukraine, and what could precipitate a solution?
I think it's difficult to see any solution coming out of this that would be acceptable to Ukraine or the West, as long as Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield. I suspect that Russia will come out of this in the longer term very severely weakened and damaged. Russia was a power in decline anyway, economically and militarily, and in terms of its population and everything else, up at this point, and that has accelerated. Russia is vastly becoming a vassal state, really, of China. Putin has this fantasy, really, that he's equal partners with Xi Jinping and China, but he's not, and China will come to dominate Russia in times to come, and that will be very uncomfortable, I think, for Russia and Russian people who know that China is no friend of theirs and has, ambitions to expand its influence in its economy and its finances, across the far east of Russia, which is a resource-rich area that the Chinese will need to draw upon in the future.
You've been part of the traditional intelligence services, and I wonder, in an age of AI, social media-based misinformation and disinformation, and partisan mainstream media, what real relevance does the work of the intelligence community have anymore?
I think it's hugely important, but not least for the reasons you're saying, because to have a intelligent, interactive human source who has access at the top of these regimes or near the top of these regimes is invaluable. And I've seen this so many times that an issue can be broken open by just one source, and it's hugely useful to the West. And of course, we saw it at the beginning of the Ukraine war, where clearly Western intelligence knew from its human sources in Moscow and elsewhere that this invasion was coming, it was going to be full scale, and was able to give the warning and prepare for it. Because autocracies rely upon surprise and shock to achieve their objectives. And I would say that that also applies to China's attitude and approach to Taiwan, for example, which will not be something that a journalist would be able to pick up on the streets or with their contacts. So I think that even signals intelligence, communications intelligence is not an interactive, intelligent way to go about it in the same way as human intelligence is, with all its flaws and its problems, is a vital part of our ability to understand particularly opaque autocratic regimes, and ones like Russia and China in which the leadership itself is in the business of lying to each other and deceiving each other. It's a very complex business, and human intelligence helps to understand it better.
Christopher Steele, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
To many intelligence, security and economic experts, China is by far the #1 threat to American interests, and yet it barely featured in the electoral campaign beyond discussions about Donald Trump's plans to impose tariffs on some Chinese imports. So why aren't the candidates focusing more on China, and who does Beijing want to win? Well, let's turn to a leading authority on such issues in the form of Martin Jacques, the author of the global bestseller, When China Rules the World. Donald Trump is often considered a little volatile, so how do you feel things might change with him?
Well, he is. You're right. He is volatile. I think that Trump represents a significant shift. I mean, of course, we've got to remember that Trump was the first guy, the first president who started really the attacks on China and so on. But I think Trump's sort of strategy, his vision, is rather different in key respects to the Biden-Harris position, in that Trump does not believe in alliances in anything like the same way. So what you have with Trump is a shift away from the paradigm of American post-1945 policies, with its emphasis on the alliances, NATO, what used to be CETO, and so on, and a much greater emphasis on the United States. And so he above all, he wants to make America great again, but not through a set of alliances, but through the success of the United States itself. And that's a retreat, I think, from, well, that's a return in a way to a pre-Second World War vision of what America's place in the world should be. So, you know, that is America on its, more America as such, and much less dependent on alliances.
Now, Martin, you have a much better understanding than most people of how, you know, tricky that balance between China and America is in its interactions. I don't think a lot of people realize it's not as simple as the headlines that are presented, you know, simply with Chinese goods, for example. Considering those two perspectives you just gave, which of the candidates do you believe China would prefer to have in the White House?
Well, I think it'll probably vary amongst the Chinese experts and so on, and advisors. I think that, I mean, I certainly recognize and see some Chinese voices. I mean, for example, like Yan Shutong, who's a leading international relations scholar, emphasizing that probably China would, on balance, probably do better with Trump than with Harris, simply because it's Trump's got much less emphasis on alliances. Having said that, of course, Trump is very big on tariffs, and I think we can expect that to happen with a vengeance in a Trump administration. He's talked about 50% tariffs on China, 10 or 20% on other countries, and so on. Now, that's going to obviously constitute a serious problem for China because China relies a lot on its exports to the United States. So I think that on balance, I would guess slightly favoring Trump in China, but I don't think they're, I think they're ready for whatever happens, whoever wins and whatever they do. I think China won't be in the same situation it was after 2016, when really I think it did expect Clinton to win. It didn't expect Trump to win. And there was a period when it had to, I think, readjust its attitudes.
Now, trade issues aside, of course, there will be the issues of geopolitical tensions that the next president will have to deal with. And I wonder what you think China will do, for example, about Taiwan. How likely is it to take some decisive action during the next US presidency? And if so, what would be the outcome?
Well, I don't think China will do anything rash. I don't think China will take military action and invade Taiwan. I think that it recognizes that that would have all sorts of consequences, some predictable and the worst probably unpredictable. So I think that the talk in America, in Washington, D.C. about, they've given, she's impatient, he's given it a certain timetable. I don't agree with this. I don't believe this. They've waited a long time. So what's the big deal? They can wait longer than that. I think the only thing that would push them is if America formally recognizes Taiwan or as an independent country or Taiwan declares, as it were, independence. I think then that would put the whole situation into a new context. Now, we should remember that when Trump first came into the presidency, he did wobble, actually, on Taiwan. He obviously was not really familiar with the issue, and he was quite provocative, and the Chinese, I think, were very concerned about this. But after that, Trump's attitude towards Taiwan, he sort of allowed things to, more or less, to proceed in the way they had previously.
One thing that a lot of people might be wondering is why the issue of China, considering this important relationship, has been so low in terms of visibility on the election campaign in the US.
I agree. I think that is interesting. And I think it does tell us something important about the nature of the divisions between the two candidates in the United States, or more generally, the sheer polarization of American politics, which is, during the Cold War, we never saw anything like that in America. America was basically as one in broad sense, from the late 1940s of the Cold War up to 2016. And now it's so polarized that even, what is regarded and is presented as the common enemy by Trump and by Harris is actually, not been a major issue of contestation or argument, or we've got to do this or we've got to do that against China. I mean, China's there, they're saying the same kind of things, but it just hasn't had the same prominence. Why? because America's so divided.
Well, Martin, I look forward to digging into your expertise on China in more detail on this show in the future. Thank you for the time on this and giving us the perspective on the US election. Talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thank you so much for joining us. No Country for Love. This is your latest book, and a long line, quite frankly. You've had some prolific years. Walk me through how the idea for this book came to you.
Well, this is my first novel. So all the books I've written before were nonfiction books about Saudi Arabia, about Middle East, and about the war in Ukraine, this latest war that started in 2022. And I was living in Kabul when the conflict in Ukraine really began in 2014 with the first Russian invasion, when Crimea was taken, when really bloody conflict erupted in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 people were killed at the time. And I remember reading about it and watching the news and being flabbergasted with just how misunderstood Ukraine was, how little knowledge there was of Ukraine's history, its past, and how everything that was known about it was known through this Russian colonial lens, because Russia was the colonial master for centuries, and all the experts and many of the journalists, having lived in Moscow, just saw Ukraine through the prism of Moscow.
As an extension.
As an extension of Russia, and explained its history through the Russian history. And I think the idea of this book for me was I was so upset about it, and I remembered my own family stories, the family stories of so many other Ukrainians, and decided to write a book that is explaining Ukraine, explaining the tragic history of Ukraine that really is, the reason why Ukrainians are so resilient in fighting against Russia today. And to do it through the history of my family, my grandmother, and the tribulations that she went through, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, which is really a period when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth. Because the combination of the famine, artificial famine, orchestrated by Moscow that killed millions and millions of people in the 1930s, the execution of the Ukrainian intellectual class, World War II, the Holocaust, and the insurgency after that war, really, wrought havoc across Ukraine and destroying its best minds and a large share of its people.
Yeah. What I found interesting about this narrative, so much of it is based, right, on the life of your grandmother.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. It's obviously it's a work of fiction, but many of the key turns in this narrative are really, based on true stories that I heard from my grandmother, from my family. And, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and, some of the actually most stunning turns of events in the book are from real life. Yeah. And it's informed by a lot of research as well. So I started writing this book in 2014, and I finished writing it just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022.
It's very interesting as well that your main character is a liberated woman, a new Soviet woman, if you will. And she sees the events of her life through that lens. She's not torn by religion in the same way that her parents were. She's not torn by social convention in the same way women in other democracies, for example, would have been torn. She sees the events of her life as a liberated woman.
Right. Well, I mean, there was a lot of promise in the initial Soviet experiment. It was tragic, and it led to massive devastation and death. But there were some elements of it, like social liberation.
Which inevitably was rolled back.
Was rolled back as the regime became more and more conservative.
Yeah.
And so this book is also a story of dashed hopes, because it begins with the main character moving to Kharkiv, which then was the capital of Ukraine, to build a new life, to build the massive tractor plant, and to join the university, and find her husband. And then all of this gets crushed by this, sort of mid-grandeur of history, as one of the characters says it, because tragedy after tragedy befalls upon her. And at the end of the day, it's a book about survival against all odds, about survival in this, circumstances that are very hard to imagine for us even now, today, even at the time when there is a horrible war going on in Ukraine. But things were so much worse back then. And the cost of that survival, the betrayals, the compromises one has to make for one's own sake, for the sake of one's children, to actually live through all of this. And is it worth it at the end? That is sort of the biggest question of the book.
Yeah, and even against the backdrop of sort of not just the history of Russia, but the history of Ukraine in relation to Russia, which is, as you say, the meat grinder of history, so much hope and promise, and a consistent, sadly, narrative of that rolling back, whether it be through armed conflict or through governments or political machinations. In your mind, where is Ukraine on that journey today?
Well, it's a very good question, and it really links back to the past, because people are all very often puzzled what is happening in Ukraine. Despite all this death and destruction, and hundreds of thousands of people are killed or maimed, fighting against overwhelming odds, the Ukrainians keep fighting and keep sacrificing and not giving up now for 2.5 years. And I think the explanation for that lies in this past. That's in the fact that everyone like me has a family that lived through all these dark years in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, when just being Ukrainian was a crime. Speaking Ukrainian could be a crime. And there was a mass genocide during the artificial famine. And so and these are the sort of policies that are now being praised in Russia again. The first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the famine of the 1930s, because they say it never happened.
Revisionist history.
Exactly. So on parts of Ukraine, it's sort of never again, but on the part of Russia, it never happened. So it's a complete denial of the tragedies of the past, and I think that explains what the Ukrainians are fighting, because they know that the alternative to surrender will be so much more death, and so much more destruction, the way it happened back in the past.
Yes. How does generational trauma play into not just the book, but also the Ukrainians' fight today?
Well, I think generational trauma is the explanation for the resilience of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian military, because there is this knowledge back in the bones of everyone. Everyone has a grandmother, great-grandmother, who either was in the camps or who had family that died in a famine, terrible famine that had cannibalism and just things that are unthinkable now, or in the war, and so, or in the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with inhuman means. Or the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with really brutal ways. And so people know that if they don't fight, if they don't keep up the resistance, the price they will pay will be much higher than what they're paying today.
Yeah. How difficult was it for you to write from a woman's perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Because you have some insight.
Yes, well, I had good readers and good advice, I guess. But I did a lot of research, and I did actually speak to my grandmother before she passed away at the age of 96. So, the older one gets, the more, I guess, the franker one gets about one's youth. Yes. So I did a lot of research in Ukraine before the war. Going to libraries, to archives. So I tried to really create the the narrative in a way that is most reflective of reality. It's obviously not a nonfiction book, but I had to be really accurate with the historical record and with the historical descriptions of the way things used to be.
Yeah. You also, in the last couple of years, have written another nonfiction book. And of course, that's about your experiences on the front lines of Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Our enemies will vanish. When you look at that book and the body of work that you did at that time and where we are today, what in your mind is the main difference? Is it the international backing for Ukraine in terms of weapons? Is it the fact that the entire world rallied around the Ukrainian cause? Perhaps not the global South, but certainly in the West?
Well, actually, so Our Enemies Will Vanish really focuses on the first year of the full-scale invasion, and not that much has actually changed since then. If you look at the map of the conflict, here and there the Russians gained, the Ukrainians gained a little bit in the Kursk region of Russia, but overall, the overall front line hasn't really changed. So there's been a war of attrition going on since then. I think what has changed is the erosion of the Russian red lines. So things that were unthinkable back then, such as long-range Ukrainian strikes, all over Russia, hitting military airfields, oil refineries, Ukraine actually invading sovereign Russian territory. All of these all of these actions were thought of as, triggering nuclear war, completely unrealistic. And yet Ukraine showed that this can be done. And I think Ukraine is successfully, since then, redrawing the parameters of the conflict. It's not able to advance in the battlefield necessarily, but it's expanding the war into Russia, and it's creating costs for Russia that it has to reckon with.
Yeah, and that there's also, of course, been the cost for Ukraine and not just lives lost. In your mind, how close are we to an end to this conflict today?
It's hard to predict, but it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, really. Russian government and President Putin and other senior members of the government have not given up on the initial aim of the invasion, which is to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country. And they still talk about Odessa and Kharkiv and Kiev as being Russian cities. And nothing indicates that they are ready to accept Ukraine as an independent state. Yeah. And the Ukrainians, while suffering from the consequences of war, economic consequences, millions of people had to leave the country, hundreds of thousands were killed or maimed. However, they're not ready to sacrifice the land that is Ukrainian, and they're not ready to give up just yet. So I think we're in for months, years, possibly, of continuing warfare.
In your mind, does the U.S. presidential election have anything to do with that timeline? Because, of course, former U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled, he'd end the war the day he got in office, or at least try to.
Well, I think, peace comes from a decision by one or both parties that they cannot achieve their objectives through war. And that requires one of the parties to be defeated, or at least to feel like they have more to lose from continuing than from stopping. And we're not at that stage yet. President Trump, former President Trump, has said he will bring peace to Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't said how. I'm sure Ukrainians would love to have peace in 24 hours. The question is at what cost?
Yeah. And politically, you don't see President Zelensky having any wiggle room when it comes to an agreement that would see him give up territory.
Possibly. I mean, it depends on how the conflict continues and depends on what level of casualties the Ukrainians sustain. But, he created new chips on the table. By occupying part of Russia, there is now part of Russia that can trade for Ukrainian territory. By having these long-range strikes into Russian territory, he can now trade that for Russia stopping attacking Ukraine with its missiles and long-range drones. Sorry.
I'll let you choke. Talk to me about the cabinet shakeup. President Zelensky, several months ago, changed up his defense minister, and then just recently his foreign minister as well. And his foreign minister was a gentleman, Dmitry Kuleba, who was well-loved by many Western democratic leaders. Was this wise, in your mind, to change horses midstream?
Well, it's not the first shakeup that the Ukrainian government has since the war began. We've had the defense minister removed, we've had General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukrainian armed forces, removed and sent to London.
Controversially.
Right, and sent to London to be ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom. So the power really rests within Bankova, the headquarters of President Zelensky's administration. That's really where all the decisions are made right now. And he removed the foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. He appointed to replace him Andriy Sybiha, who was the main foreign policy advisor to the presidency, former Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey and Poland. And then in another sort of important shakeup, the Minister of Strategic Industries, which means the Minister of the Military Industries, Commission was moved to the presidency to be the president's advisor for strategic industries, which is actually a raise, a promotion. So at the end of the day, the only two people who make sort of all the main calls are Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak.
Who is a controversial figure.
Well, everyone is a controversial figure.
In your mind, especially with this, the promotion of is it now the ministry? He's now an advisor to the president. That, of course, is interesting from a business perspective because there were comments very early on by those in business in Ukraine. They were worried about being nationalized, industries from energy to what is now military production. In your mind, are those fears valid?
Well, I can speak to military production. I think what's happening is that there was a decision to really expand that sphere, which is critical for Ukraine's survival, especially in things like drone production, to the private sector. So there's there are hundreds of individual producers that are all competing for these projects and are being paid by the government, partially with Western assistance. And we have seen the results in the drone industry of Ukraine really taking a leap and developing technologies that allow it to strike very long distances, more than 1,000 miles away in Russia, and really dominating the battlefield with drones in a way that Russia cannot, even though Russia has a much bigger industrial base.
And today, the drone warfare between Russia and Ukraine is the most deadly.
Well, it's certainly critical, because everything is now determined by drones. FPV drones that cost a couple of $100 can now kill tanks, and that cost millions of dollars. And they're being used every day.
In your mind, when it comes to the situation today in Ukraine, is it more or less corrupt than before the invasion?
Well, it's hard to say. War obviously corrupts. Every war creates opportunities for corruption. We've seen it in every war in human history. Just read Catch-22. What Ukraine also has is a very robust independent media, and so it does expose instances of corruption. The scandal of the defense ministry, where the result of which the minister had to leave and some of his deputies ended up in jail, was because of exposure by the Ukrainian media about kickbacks in the procurement of actually eggs for the military, and you have scandals breaking out all the time, and action is being taken when it's public. So I think this is the strength of Ukraine when compared to Russia, where I'm sure there is just as much more corruption, but because it's swept under the rug, very often you see the results of that in the underperformance of the Russian military.
We've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE both instrumental in conversations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, working with the United States. How interesting is that to you? Because you and I have both covered the Gulf countries for a long time now. I think that seeing that foreign policy influence in quite this way is really a new move for the Gulf.
Yeah, well, it's a trio, really. It's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey. And I think they all three work in coordination on key issues, obviously the prisoner exchanges, but also exchanges of this recent hostage swap deal, in which my colleague Evan Gershkovich was released in Turkey, was also partially negotiated with the help of Saudi Arabia. And actually President Putin publicly thanked Saudi Arabia for its help in this. And so these three countries have this unique position of being aligned with the U.S., but also having full relations with Russia. They have not imposed any sanctions. There are flights every day from Dubai or from Istanbul to Moscow. And so they have these lines of communication and are trusted by both sides.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because a few years ago, I would have suggested that Saudi Arabia or the UAE be the conduit for conversations, for example, with China, between the U.S. and China. And privately, I got a lot of pushback from U.S. officials who were not interested in allowing that to happen. But this invasion really sort of upset the table, in a sense, and brought the Gulf Arab countries very much into the fore of international relations in a way that they weren't before.
Right. But also, the U.S. has a direct line to China. Yeah. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese officials meet and talk. That's not the case on higher levels between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah. So they need all the help they can get.
Exactly. And, it's an issue of trust. There has to be a place for this exchange, for example.
Yeah.
That both sides trust. Turkey or Saudi Arabia, UAE are one of these places.
You're also the author of a book, The Siege of Mecca. Obviously, you covered what's been a drastic change for the kingdom in the last several years with King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, his son, the crown prince. In your mind, does Saudi Arabia today have an issue when it comes to how quickly they've modernized, how quickly they've become, frankly, a new country under MBS's reforms?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the one answer to this is that we haven't really seen any pushback that is concerning. There hasn't been violence, there hasn't been protests. So the society seems to be accepting all this, also because society has changed.
Yes.
With such a huge share of the population being young and much more open to these new ideas, to
and having access to phones, which has changed everything.
Yes, exactly. So, Saudi Arabia of today is a very different country from Saudi Arabia of even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I think the history of the book, of the Siege of Mecca and the actual Siege of Mecca, was that in 1979, as a prize for supporting the government retaking the Grand Mosque of Mecca, which was taken by a bunch of radicals from all over the world, the government of Saudi Arabia at the time agreed to reverse the slow liberalization of the country and to give the religious establishment control over much of the society. So that has ended under Mohammed bin Salman. The religious police was disbanded, and this, frankly, the country's on social level, in terms of personal freedoms, especially for women, is so much more open than it was a few years ago.
Yeah. So they have learned the lessons, in your mind, of what it means to frankly, hand over your power to religious autocracy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But also, times have changed all over the world.
Yeah. Talk to me about Afghanistan, because obviously you had a front row seat for not only the war in Afghanistan, but also, of course, the evacuation of the U.S. and the U.K. and other NATO members as they decided to leave that country. Yeah. Disaster to disaster. Where are we today?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, on one hand, yes, the Taliban regime is terrible. The restrictions on women are harrowing. Girls cannot go to school. Women have a hard time having permission to work. But if you were to ask ordinary Afghans, especially in villages, not in the cities, many would tell you that this is all terrible, but there is no war.
Yeah.
Nobody's dying. And this is a new thing for Afghanistan. For 40 years,
yes,
there was constant war.
Yes.
And so and that explains why there is no resistance to the Taliban today, because no matter how difficult the restrictions are, the fact that people do not have to bury their children every day, the fact that there's no bombings, no raids, they can travel the country, go to markets, visit each other, I think still outweighs any appeal that the resistance might have against the Taliban for now.
In your mind, what is the responsibility of the West to these women that we told you can live a modern, full life?
I think it's huge.
We've abandoned.
I think it's huge. I mean, there were many promises made to the people of Afghanistan over the course of decades, actually, 20 years of Western presence there. And then one day the U.S. just picked up and left, with people trying to cling on to the wheels of the planes taking off in Kabul airport. I was there watching it.
Yes. Is this a stain on the Biden presidency?
I think it's a stain not just on the Biden presidency. I think it's a stain on the collective record of the West and the U.S. and on the credibility that the U.S. has with potential allies. And I would say more. I think this is one of the reasons that inspired President Putin to invade Ukraine, because watching the disaster in Kabul in the summer of 2021, he could not help himself but conclude that we have nothing to fear from the West. And also, it's one of the reasons why the U.S. and others refused to give weapons to Ukraine before the war, because the images of the Taliban driving Humvees and MRAPs and even flying Blackhawks were enough to convince the US and allies that, if we give weapons to the Ukrainians, we'll see the same once the Russians take over Kiev. So it was a double blow to the Ukrainians.
Yaroslav, it's great to have you. No Country for Love, new book, everybody buy it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake, and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Your Royal Highness, I want to kick off by just kind of asking you to give us, in your mind, the greatest challenge that we're going to face in the short term when it comes to AI. Because at the end of the day, this is a service that people are using right now, as we know, mostly for fun, but this is going to become a part of our everyday lives in a way perhaps that most people don't realize.
Well, I think it's such an honor for me to be here as well, talking about literally my favorite subject. I'm a technology optimist because I really do believe that with better data, we really can make some of the world's greatest decisions. But you're totally right. What are some of the things in the short term that we all should be thinking about to make sure that we are kind of a little bit more in control and can really feel like this sector is actually working for us, rather than feel that we're kind of marching towards, a 2001 Space Odyssey without that authenticity that we, that I think as consumers, individuals, and sort of thoughtful individuals need to think about. So one of the ways that I look at this is that the whole sector really needs to do a fantastic job at bringing people into the conversation. I think one of the reasons why I've been in Abu Dhabi and being a part of this conversation has been about looking at the Enact Majlis that His Excellency Dr. Sultan put together to think about this moment of sort of short-term need married to kind of the long-term potential and what that means for climate change and sustainability, and ask that opportunity to ask the best questions. So for me, what I learned and what I am learning through this sector is the fact that we're still at the very earliest stages. And if we all kind of find and focus on that moment of collaboration, we really can move the needle to get to this technology to where it really needs to go. But we need to have everyone's voice at the table. We need to have the energy sector, we need to have the AI companies, we need to have the individuals, but most importantly, we also need the consumers as well to come along on that journey with us, to really make the, to really move the needle, to make sure that everyone's getting what they need out of this. When I look at some of the opportunities in AI, I liken it sort of as it's a very big, powerful tool, but it's a solution looking for a problem. So we can actually reimagine the entire sort of moment, as it were, if we're prepared to kind of lean in, ask better questions. Sometimes you have to ask permission to clear up a misunderstanding. And this is one of the reasons why, moments like this and prepared to sort of create spaces for collaboration can make a big difference.
What's your greatest concern there? Is it sort of the space between AI, obviously, hopefully a force for good? Is it mirroring us as human beings, our intelligence, or it's going beyond it? Because the question is, we're imperfect. And of course, we would not want a tool to create even more imperfection.
So what keeps me awake at night in terms of the, is the fact that, AI really does need sort of the intelligence that we need to gather really does need to be sort of equal representatives. And so one of the areas that I really want to focus on in this sector is actually promoting really positive leadership for a lot of these companies, including some of the most amazing women in technology. Because when I think about the fact that what's being coded in, what are we learning from, what are the IP materials that we're training on, where is the data coming from, that's the bit that I really want to think about as the most diverse group of mindsets that we can really think about. That's where the force for good can really come in. What I noticed about my career in technology, it was that it was an incredibly open-minded field. It really does come with an invitation to invite a lot of people to the table. But we need to do a little bit better to make sure that we are creating the spaces and the opportunities to invite people to collaborate with some of these tools.
To avoid those potential biases.
Yeah, to avoid bias, but also to lead, to ask questions, to lean in, to think about, where can we apply this best intelligence? And how do we make it beautiful? How do we make it thoughtful? And how can we actually serve humanity? And I think at the moment, we're not doing enough to think about some of the bigger human questions. I'm really inspired by, some of the programs that I'm seeing in healthcare and in sustainability, because we know that those are areas that we have vast amounts of data on, and we really can ask fantastic questions. So those are the two sectors that I'm really excited about, to see how we can channel the human good into those questions. In terms of sort of the more sort of the consumer product side and more of the sort of the everyday usage, I think we really haven't seen the best the opportunities in that area to really maximize their full potential as yet. But as the consumer becomes more aware of what their data is doing, as they have more control of it, as they have more excitement to collaborate, and I think we will see a few more kind of fantastic use cases that can really move the needle for human good.
And speaking of the consumer, I mean, to your point, at this point it's quite nascent, and perhaps the consumer doesn't even really understand what their data is and potentially where it's going to be held and how it could be used. It's a Pandora's box.
Yes, and I would really advise, those individuals and the consumers and those, to spend the time to kind of educate themselves as well, because there is such potential here to really move the needle. Even learning about some of the organizations now that are, working with young people, working in education, working in healthcare. That data is fabulous. But again, making sure that you're aware of it, you know what it's doing, and how you can actually, partner with your data as well
to make it work for you.
To make it work for you, and then we can ask really big questions. We can ask of our future what we want.
How quickly do you see that shift happening? Because as Dr. Sultan mentioned yesterday, at the moment, the majority of searches, the majority of ChatGPT, people are entertaining themselves. It's a joke. It's for fun, and that's using up so much energy. So there's a social responsibility that comes with the development of AI. And I think, as to your point, people as yet don't really understand that connection.
I think the sector is doing, the companies and the individuals that are really excited about it, really are fostering fantastic relationships with, the end consumers. We've got, working with them on the users and working with them to kind of sort of create as many opportunities as we can. But for me, the best applications I'm seeing are slightly more focused. I thought what Dr. Sultan said as well of taking large enterprises and working to really ask the most fantastic questions is sort of the secret to this. Is where can our sort of extra level of intelligence really move the needle for large change? And that's what I'm seeing in energy and healthcare.
It was fascinating in our conversations yesterday with 60 of the biggest
folks in energy and in tech talking about AI and how it can be applied to daily life. We're used to saying data centers, but the term I heard yesterday, which was fabulous, for intelligence factories. I thought that was fantastic. And to your point, asking those better questions and taking that societal responsibility. There are going to be questions about where those data centers are going to be located, and that's a security question, that's a geopolitical question. This sort of could quickly snowball into, frankly, it's a question of foreign policy. In your mind, how do we keep these conversations on the right path?
Honestly, it takes great leaders, and it takes leadership, and it takes, again, that moment of collaboration. These are fantastic tools. They're tools that can really move the needle, but they need a lot. So how can we foster relationships that can really allow for that collaboration, and you can keep the correct balance of climate, energy, invention, transformation, and innovation at the heart of it. I think leadership is key, and collaborative leadership. So you have to have a growth mindset. I think one of the reasons why even the use of sort of the phrase artificial intelligence has, I think, done a disservice to the actual intelligence that we're creating. You think about the word artificial. It immediately
doesn't inspire confidence.
It's not inspiring. It's terrifying. But actually, thinking about intelligence and reimagining what intelligence looks like. I also have dyslexia, and thinking about intelligence was something that I grew up at school, and everyone was like, "Oh, you're not smart enough. You're not intelligent. You're not this. You're not that," because I'm not traditionally smart in one way. And for me, technology gave my brain a totally different set of tools to be able to do that. And so I kind of look at this sort of sector of intelligence as an opportunity, but we have to do more to invite people into the conversation. We have to be prepared to collaborate. We have to ask better questions, and we have to sort of do more to make sure that more are invited to the conversation.
Yeah. Speaking of that, we were speaking a little bit earlier about the Global South and the role that the Global South will play, not only in AI, but in energy going forward in regards to critical minerals, regards to data centers. In your mind, is this actually perhaps a pathway to bringing the Global South with us in a way perhaps that we haven't done before?
I would like to think so, and I'll tell you why. Because with the role of intelligence and asking better questions, I think that there's much more of a role for everyone to have a stake in the game. So what that means is that no country or no individual will be able to do this alone. It takes ecosystems. It takes thoughtful ecosystems. So how can you design things that allow everyone to have a seat at the table? So where your data centers are, where your energy is coming from, where your actual data is flowing, no one place is going to be able to do this on its own. It really does call for incredible collaboration, and what that means for emerging markets, what that means for young people, to can think about that hope, to think about where they live in terms of being a global citizen and being a contributor. Technology and the tools that technology can give us can really sort of change the game in terms of where you live, how you think, and where you can collaborate. So for me, I look at this world as I'm hopefully an internal optimist. Geopolitics currently, we need to do a bit more to foster these relationships of kindness and collaboration. But I think where I see technology really acting as a tool so that we can catch more people with the imagination to create.
Do you think that AI has the power to resolve conflict, to end wars?
I think we have to do a little bit more to collaborate if we're really going to see the potential of these tools to bring to bear some of the questions the planet needs us to answer. We need better data in terms of what our planet is asking us to do. The legacy of COP28 has really taught me that no one should be left behind, no matter what sector you're in, and no matter what industry you find yourself faced with. You have to ask, now is the time to ask better questions, and how can better intelligence, better data strengthen the human capabilities for kindness, and how can we actually do more to invest in that kindness and invest in each other, and how can better data play a role in that?
Tell me this, we've been talking so much obviously about the potential for the UAE in this part of the world with regards to AI, simply because in this part of the world, obviously with oil and gas and other fossil fuels, we can fuel that technology. They can do the same thing in the United States. It's a different story for Europe. It's a different story in the UK. In the United Kingdom, energy prices are 4 times higher than in the United States. In your mind, does the UK have the potential to be left behind simply because they don't have the same resources?
The wonderful thing that we have in the UK is incredible talent. And we have incredible opportunities with great talent, great individuals. And talent and thoughtful talent really plays a huge part in this as well. So how can we invest in that talent? What are we doing in order to really move the needle to make sure that there is hope in this sector as well? That's another huge aspect.
Do you feel like there is hope right now?
I'd like to think so. I think I'm making it my whole life's mission to think about how hope and technology can kind of work in a collaboration mindset. So I'm probably very passionate about creating hope, and working on a few projects across the board to think about what that hope really means. Talent, skills, women in leadership, these are just some of the ways that I think that we can sort of talk about hope that really can foster fantastic opportunities for this technology to kind of work in line with some of the things that are really needed.
Your Royal Highness, it's wonderful to have you here at ADIPEC 2024.
Thank
you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous